Dr. Dan anxiously paced in his cell. It was the only way he'd been able to occupy himself for the past 6 months, save for poring through files and, when he was lucky, being able to oversee another failed termination attempt. He only stopped pacing when, for a brief and horrible moment, he realized that monster was probably doing the exact same thing in its big metal cube at this very moment. That horrible creature that he'd thrown away his life for a futile shot at killing. Perhaps the whole thing had been a fool's errand. After all, he was formerly a researcher under the employ of the SCP Foundation. Secure, contain, protect. They had truly sadistic beasts like SCP-106, the Nightmarish Old Man, and SCP-352 Baba Yaga in containment cells, and there was no plans to terminate either of them. They weren't the Global Occult Coalition for 343's sake. Why did Dr. Dan even want to terminate SCP-096 in the first place? He tried to explain it to them again and again, but his pleas had fallen on deaf ears. In his mind, the impetus for destroying the Shy Guy was terrifyingly clear. It was a monster that killed anyone or anything that looked at its face, even a photograph of it, even a tiny collection of pixels. When its rage state was induced, it seemed that nothing would stop it. It would have an intuitive psychic link to its victim, charge at them at breakneck speed, and only find its zen again once all of them were dead. And if a picture of SCP-096 was leaked onto the internet, it would cause a chain reaction that triggered an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. There were plenty of creatures and entities that the Foundation knew about that could theoretically bring about the apocalypse, but to him, 096 was the most realistic. It preyed upon the inherent curiosity and thirst for knowledge seated in every human heart. The same drive to simply know that led to the creation of the SCP Foundation would be humanity's doom in the face of an SCP-096 outbreak. And if such a thing happened, the Foundation would need to break the masquerade of secrecy to have any hope of saving humanity. In his many feverish nightmares, Dr. Dan had seen it all so clearly. The first photographs of SCP-096's face would be leaked online. Perhaps a few hundred people across the globe would look, in disparate enough locations that it would be almost impossible for the Foundation to detect and save all of them, as SCP-096 went on its bloody rampage. Of course, as the image proliferated, as images on the internet often do, the purview of 096's violence would only grow. People across the nation would start to take notice, and soon after that, across the world. Mysterious creature causing mass casualties would be the headline on every news desk, because why would anybody want to talk about anything else? Perhaps some foolish reporters would take video footage of the creature. Everyone has a phone these days with high-definition cameras. Pictures would be taken and posted. More and more of it would flood the internet. Too many simultaneous moles for even the SCP Foundation to whack. The news would spread. Panic and hysteria would spread. People wouldn't even know what's triggering all this horror if the Foundation didn't go public and tell them that it was the pictures that was killing everyone. And by then, wouldn't it already be too late? The antidote to fear is knowledge. It's why when anything goes wrong, we're refreshing timelines and feeds and news websites for any kind of information. And if you were told an unstoppable monster was killing scores of people and might be coming to a neighborhood near you sometime soon, wouldn't you want a good look at it? Wouldn't you want to know your enemy? Having no idea that the mere act of knowing was what sealed your horrible fate. By Dr. Dan's bleak estimations, if only several million people died as a result of this kind of scenario, it could be considered a positive outcome. He'd seen it all, but no matter how many times he tried to articulate this to his superiors, he wasn't listened to. They didn't take him or the threat that SCP-096 posed seriously. Every time he warned of the apocalyptic potential of SCP-096, he was simply told to get back to working on those goggles. It was why he needed to give those naysayers a demonstration. It was why a certain photograph needed to show up in the home of a certain mountaineer. It's why all those people had to die. There was no other way. The deaths of the civilians and the researchers and the Mobile Task Force members were, of course, regrettable. but it was the only way to prevent the deaths of so many more. They gave him what he wanted: permission to put this gangly time bomb in the ground, even if the beast's death was inextricably tied to his own execution at the hands of the very employers who authorized him. The world was full of funny little ironies like that. Another one is that even though Dr. Dan now had the authorization and funding to terminate SCP-096, he was discovering that he lacked another important factor: the capability. They tried incinerating it, exposing it to massive amounts of radiation, exposing it to an insane degree of kinetic trauma, the equivalent of being hit by an out-of-control bullet train. They tested every kind of experimental, off-the-books weaponry that they had access to through various research projects. Proton blasts, lasers, high-intensity energy beams. Nothing. Even when they fried off every scrap of flesh on the monster's body, its unbreakable skeleton still remained, and in what seemed like no time at all, it'd be back in action. Its very existence seemed to mock him. A guard opened his cell door, staring disdainfully at the disgraced researcher. That same guard had slammed his head against a wall a month earlier. One of his friends had apparently been killed in the legendary 096 containment breach that set this whole sordid thing in motion.
"Up and at 'em, scumbag,"
he said in a gruff, surly voice, training a handgun on the doctor he knew wouldn't fight back.
"They need you in test chamber 6.
Dr. Dan allowed himself a small grin, imperceptible to the guard who clearly hated his guts. They'd approved his 096 versus 682 cross-test. Marvelous. How marvelous. To all the others, it would seem like just one more entry in a long line of 682 cross-tests. He thought it darkly funny. In his eyes, the Foundation had no hope of ever killing SCP-682. Its defining quality was being impossible to kill, and it didn't present nearly the threat to the entire world that 096 posed. Their futile attempts to murder the lizard were little more than a money sink to justify the site's exorbitant funding. But perhaps he could turn this to his benefit. Maybe SCP-682 would hold the secret to actually killing off his nemesis. Within 30 hours, Dr. Dan had his disappointing answer. Both anomalies had undeniably done a real number on each other, and Dr. Dan did take a kind of sick amusement in the mental trauma that SCP-682 had induced in 096. But ultimately, it was all for nothing. 682 had skinned 096 alive and melted off its flesh with acid, but once again, that indestructible skeleton stood firm. This had been the 27th termination attempt since the incident. The 27th failed termination attempt, Dr. Dan mentally corrected himself. 096's skeleton kept defeating them. Even their most ardent attempts to penetrate the bones and destroy the creature within had failed. During a previous attempt, they tried to access the brain by putting a diamond-hard drill into its eye sockets. Of course, it was the drill that actually broke, much to Dr. Dan's seemingly tireless frustration. Needless to say, in the debriefing interview with Dr. Carver, a researcher who once would have considered him a colleague, he wasn't in high spirits. If he managed to kill this thing, then he would always be the hero who made a terrible sacrifice in order to save many more lives. If he didn't kill 096, he was little more than the monster who murdered all those innocent people for nothing. Though you'd never hear him say it out loud. If it wasn't for that damnable, indestructible skeleton, this monster would be long dead already. If only there was some way to break the creature's bones. That's when it hit him. SCP-173, the sculpture. A Site-19 icon often overlooked because of its more silent but deadly style, but undeniably one of the most frightening and dangerous anomalies out there. It had racked up a truly shocking body count since it was first interred at Site-19 in 1993, one broken neck at a time, and it's one of the few creatures out there that even the hard-to-destroy reptile himself is utterly terrified of. Perhaps a monster that practically has a PhD in breaking bones would be the ideal candidate to vandalize the Shy Guy's vertebrae. Once his proposal was greenlit for initial testing, Dr. Dan arranged for the Shy Guy, with a bag over his head of course, to be brought into a testing chamber with the ever-stoic SCP-173. When all of the researchers and guards were safely outside, all it took was a single blink to make all of Dr. Dan's darkest dreams come true. In the nanoseconds his eyes were closed, he heard the most beautiful sounds in the world. A loud, fleshy crunch and a pained howl from 096. He opened his eyes to an equally wondrous sight. 096 doubled over at an unnatural angle. Its spine snapped between the 4th and 5th vertebrae, spinal fluid leaking down the creature's flank. That freaky little sculpture had done it. It had actually damaged the integrity of the Shy Guy's skeleton. It was at that moment that Dr. Dan knew he could kill this thing. Admittedly, there was a containment breach shortly after that when the bag slipped off of 096's head, and it charged through the nearby steel wall, killing multiple people before being subdued and recontained. But when it comes to projects involving Dr. Dan, a mere handful of innocent people being killed sits comfortably within the acceptable margin of error. A day later, Dr. Dan was standing before a crowded boardroom, with agents, researchers, and even a few members of the O5 Council in attendance. He explained his findings to them, and the fact that, even more importantly, they may have a way to bring the wretched existence of 096 to an absolute halt. His plans were approved. Not long after, he was putting them into motion. Dr. Dan was surrounded by researchers and heavily armed guards as 173 was escorted into the test chamber with a forklift. 096 was there, still bagged. Off to the side was a giant tub of hydrofluoric acid connected to a hose and injector attachment. If this didn't work, nothing would. Everyone stood back in a safe zone as 173 was released to do its thing. Crunch. Just like the previous time, 096's spine had been successfully snapped. Spinal fluid dribbled down its skin. Everyone had rushed into the chamber. One group kept 173 isolated with their stares. The other, headed by Dr. Dan, prepared the acid injector and shoved it into the breach in 096's spine. As the acid was pumped by the gallon into 096's bones, the creature let out the most horrifying wail. It kicked and bucked as more acid was pumped in, melting those indestructible bones from within. The creature even began to vomit acid as it panicked, melting the bag off of its own head. Some panicked and averted their gaze. Dr. Dan didn't. He stared directly at the creature's face for the first time as it melted in front of him with nothing short of pure elation. Had he won? Had he actually won? The creature let out a gurgling shriek and the guards opened fire. Their bullets splattered into the monster's melting flesh and bones as it hollered and shrieked. They didn't let up, firing up and down its body, spraying it with white-hot lead. It began to melt and bubble away, expanding into a great, gruesome puddle on the floor beneath them. Dr. Dan laughed like a madman. Even as the guards grabbed him and dragged him away from the foul-smelling, greasy mess, bubbling with chemical life, he just kept laughing. Even though he knew the death of 096 meant an equally swift death of his own, it didn't matter. It had all been for something. The world was saved. It was over. He'd finally won. SCP-099, also known as the Tickle Monster. It's one of the most adorable, beloved, and undeniably wholesome anomalies ever to exist in the SCP Foundation's containment facilities. Its mere presence can cause joy and comfort, cure depression and other mental illnesses, and even sometimes cause violent and unpredictable creatures to really mellow out. If you're a fan of this channel, chances are that you're a big fan of SCP-999 too. But that doesn't mean everyone is on board. As we all know, there are plenty of entities and groups in the SCP universe that are downright evil, and as a result would love to see this little blob of pure joy crushed to a pulp or sacrificed to a cosmic horror. But you can't ever underestimate. Wait a second, is that a containment breach alarm? All Foundation staff members report to the affected cell immediately. It looks like an SCP has escaped containment and is now in our world? That's right. SCP-999 has broken out of SCP Foundation control, and now you can finally have a Tickle Monster of your very own. in plush form. This super adorable plush from SCP Swag is 11 inches of huggable, squeezable joy, and now that the Tickle Monster is out of containment, you can bring it into your own home. Tickle Monster plushies are available for pre-order now, and all orders made in the next 10 days also get a special limited first edition card. Worldwide shipping is also available, so go to scpswag.com right now and pre-order your own Tickle Monster. And let us know in the comments what SCP anomalies you want to see in plush form next. But as we were saying, you can't ever underestimate SCP-999. Not only has it tickled SCP-682 into submission, there are also certain theories floating around the Foundation that it will one day grow so powerful, its forces of pure goodness and joy can overthrow the Scarlet King himself. That's why today, we're throwing the Tickle Monster into a kind of royal rumble with all the baddest dudes the Foundation has ever encountered. And we're going to give our theories on how SCP-999 might somehow find the good in even the blackest of hearts. First, SCP-096, the Shy Guy, a killing machine so brutal, direct, and opaque in its motives that some have even questioned whether it actually has sentience. However, we'd personally stake our claim that it does. When a photo of this savage beast was taken with SCP-978, the Desire camera, a camera that shows the deepest desire of its subjects, it revealed that the Shy Guy secretly just had the desire to disappear. Not only does this suggest that the monster may not actually like killing people, but the very idea that it can have a desire also implies some level of intelligence. But how would SCP-999 enter the mix? Well, we know that 096 is an anxious creature. It spends the majority of its time just pacing its cell, and when someone sees its face, it begins sobbing uncontrollably before entering its rage state. Does this sound like a happy entity to you? If the Shy Guy encountered 999 at its full joy-giving power, we'd personally think that it might finally chill out a little. Perhaps it'd take a moment to breathe and contemplate life a little more. Maybe it would wonder why it's so ashamed of its face and feels the need to hunt down and kill anyone who sees it. After all, there are much uglier anomalies, like SCP-106. He's the next monster to join this weird, wild cage match against SCP-999. While 096 is violent, 106 is downright malevolent. He's not just sentient, but extremely intelligent. The old man loves causing pain and suffering for his own perverse pleasure, just as much as heavy hitters like SCP-682. So surely 999 would have its work cut out for it here. Well, not necessarily. There are two leading theories about who 106 actually is, one being the Scranton theory, and the other the Corporal Lawrence theory. The first dictates that 106 is the result of Dr. Robert Scranton, physically and mentally transformed by his time in SCP-3001, the terrifying Red Reality. The second theory was that he was a World War I soldier known as Corporal Lawrence, whose anomalous encounter in the trenches turned him into the beast he is today. In either case, he's a man shaped by pain and anomalous trauma. Much like 096, the Desire camera revealed an insight into 106's mind. His greatest desire consists of him walking across a field towards an old house, where an old woman smiles and waits for him. Many believe this old woman to be his estranged wife. Perhaps an encounter with SCP-999 would cause 106's sadism to abate, reminding him of the humanity he once had. Maybe he'd become a kindly old man in the aftermath, who prefers Werther's originals to violence and spinning long, rambling yarns about the war rather than chasing people around his terrifying pocket dimension. It's a thought so sweet it could almost make you sick. Thankfully, one of our favorite doctors is next on the list, specifically the Plague Doctor, SCP-049. While he definitely isn't as dangerous or malicious as either of his predecessors, 049 has racked up quite a body count in his hundreds of years of operations. He sees pestilence everywhere he goes, except within, and can kill with a mere touch. However, his deadly touch only seems to apply to non-anomalous animals and humans, not other anomalies. So he definitely couldn't harm 999, and the Tickle Monster, conversely, could definitely touch him back. While the Plague Doctor is the serious type, he might not be able to keep his bedside manner after a serious tickling, and we'd be more than willing to hedge our bets on him having the laugh of an angel. While 049 may have folded in the face of 999's tickling wrath, our next contestant is as solid as a rock. Well, technically, as solid as concrete. That's because it's SCP-173, also known as the Sculpture or the Peanut. It shows no emotions and murders anything that blinks in its presence by snapping its neck. But 999 doesn't even have bones, let alone a neck, so SCP-173 has nothing with which to threaten this happy little blob. And what about SCP-999's counteroffensive? If the Tickle monster got its slime all over SCP-173, it might finally reform this statuesque serial killer through prolonged exposure. Maybe after that, 173 will finally give relaxing neck massages rather than snapping them. But while the sculpture may be intimidating, it's nothing compared to an unkillable, mass-murdering Blade Master, right? Of course, we're talking about SCP-096, also known as Abel. No matter how many times he gets put down, he keeps coming back, with unparalleled skills in physical combat and the ability to pull huge blades out of thin air. He also appears to be fueled by pure, unstoppable rage. So how on earth could our adorable little Tickle monster possibly go toe-to-toe with a swordsman who cuts through elite mobile task force soldiers like a hot knife through a D-class? Much like SCP-106, it seems like a lot of Abel's rage is rooted in a deep pain caused by his past. If he truly is the biblical Abel, it's likely that his rage stems from being the very first murder victim, betrayed and killed by his brother Cain, now known as SCP-073. Spending time with SCP-999 might finally calm him down enough to actually work through some of these issues and come to a sense of closure. Maybe with SCP-999 at his side, Abel could attend some therapy sessions with Foundation psychologists, until he finally felt as though he'd moved past his murderous urges, perhaps even working up to family counseling with Cain. He could then re-enter society and reapply his expert knife skills and become a Bobby Flay-style celebrity chef. Except one who could actually flay you if you got on his bad side. But let's talk about an SCP that's frankly dangerous to even discuss. I am, of course, referring to SCP-2521. Okay, great, I'm not dead. Wonderful, let's carry on. 2521 is attracted to any information about it, written or spoken. It will immediately appear upon the creation of this information and steal either the information itself or the person disseminating it, in the case of verbal words. If someone were to pass SCP-999 a fact sheet about SCP-2521, it would inevitably manifest and prepare to throw down. But perhaps the positive influence of SCP-999 would change SCP-2521's tune. Rather than obsessively stealing information about itself, the being may instead finally open up and speak about itself. We might even learn some interesting things, like the fact it used to have a bowling team with SCP-106 and SCP-049. He also loves knitting.
Oh, come on, not again!
Now how about we go for something a little closer to human, please? SCP-082, Ferdinand the Cannibal. A huge ogre-like humanoid that has a penchant for pathological lies and also devouring human heads. And, well, the rest of the body on, and, well, the rest of the body too, if he's worked up enough of an appetite. He's super strong and has a hide so thick that seemingly no weapon can penetrate it. How could SCP-999 possibly go around with a behemoth like this? Lucky for 999, Ferdinand has an extremely cheerful temperament. If a potential victim can keep him amused, often listening and playing along with his elaborate fantasies, it massively increases their chance of survival. And considering SCP-999 is literally a good vibes machine, there's a good chance that it'd keep Ferdinand so amused that the thought of getting hangry wouldn't even cross his mind. Once again, little SCP-999 takes home the W. But what about a real sadist? A truly heartless monster whose commitment to focused, endless cruelty is genuinely unparalleled. We're talking about the being from SCP-3999. This terrifyingly powerful reality warper hasn't racked up scores of victims, because it prefers the quality of suffering over quantity. It'll select a single victim, trap them in their own personal hell, and spend a literal eternity conceiving every possible torture and torment to break the spirit and body of the victim, never giving them the luxury of death. However, if an entity could turn the tables and break the spirit of SCP-3999, it would be SCP-999. Picture it. thousands of years where the monster tries everything it can to break the Tickle monster's spirit, only to find its own spirit being broken as SCP-999 doesn't succumb to any of it, and continues to project love and kindness throughout. Could you imagine anything more frustrating for a creature like 3999? Eventually, it would probably get so frustrated that it would let 999 go, and find some hapless Foundation researcher to torture instead. Going up against a single anomalous being, regardless of its power, is one thing, but taking on an entire group is another challenge for SCP-999. What if 999 became trapped in SCP-3008, the Endless IKEA, surrounded by the deadly staff in the middle of the night? Our theory is that the positive presence of SCP-999 would really help the nightmarish malformed staff of this accursed IKEA turn their lives around, and start creating a more positive work environment around the store. Rather than trying to chase survivors trapped inside the store and beat them to death, they would instead help them find the ideal furniture for enhancing their lifestyle if they ever managed to escape the building. 999 would help them go from horrifying to helpful in no time. It'd be so nice in there that the survivors wouldn't even want to leave. But what about groups of interest? Let's say the Chaos Insurgency has broken into a containment site in another one of its classic raids against the Foundation. Would a group of elite Chaos Insurgency operatives be able to take down the Tickle monster? We think not. While these anomaly-stealing militants may be hardcore compared to your average Joe, they're nowhere near as hateful or irredeemable as the likes of 682 or 106. Chances are, if they've spent any amount of time around 999, they'd experience a sudden sense of mellowness and begin to rethink all of their poor life choices. But what about the GOC? Those government stooges obsessed with killing any anomaly they can get their hands on. Personally, we theorize that a run-in with SCP-999 and the immensely positive feelings it causes would cause them to reevaluate their entire philosophy on the anomalies they encounter and lead them to restructure their entire organization from the ground up. Perhaps they'd even promote SCP-999 to the position of Undersecretary General, and perhaps even change the meaning of the group's acronym to Givers of Cuddles in honor of their new leader and direction. We can dream, right? But let's end this dream with a nightmare. The Scarlet King, the most dangerous being in the entire multiverse, who is also strongly believed to be SCP-999's real father. Awkward. Can ultimate good someday defeat ultimate evil? According to ancient Diavate prophecies, a terrifying historical culture that worshipped the Scarlet King, yes, it can, if given the time and nurturing it needs to reach full power. How exactly would that battle play out? Well, it's difficult to even theorize, but chances are it'd be a battle of truly biblical proportions. And if ever the Scarlet King did breach our dimension, it's safe to say that you'd want your own little SCP-999 close at hand. And now, you can. Go to scpswag.com and pre-order a Tickle Monster plush of your very own. It doesn't even need any anomalous powers to bring you a ridiculous amount of joy. Orders placed in the next 10 days get a special limited first edition card, so don't wait. Get yours now before they're all gone. Let's start off with a difficult question. How do you define reality? What is truly real? Is it simply a case of what we can see? If something is known as fact and can be proven to exist, does this make it real? Is reality just the world around us, or is there something more? The goal of these questions isn't to make you question every part of the world around you, or to question whether or not we are all living in a computer simulation. No, you're asked this to help you understand reality. Because first of all, we aren't living in a simulation. We're living in a sitcom. There is a wide-ranging debate on what the most powerful and dangerous SCPs ever encountered are, but there is no denying the ever-present danger of SCP-3812. This Keter-class entity is regarded as highly aggressive by the O5 Council, especially as it has only ever been partially contained, never fully. The true scope of its abilities is currently unknown, and any available information on SCP-3812 is kept classified and secure by the Foundation. Needless to say, this entity poses a direct threat not only to the SCP Foundation, but to the very fabric of reality itself. Contained within the file for SCP-3812 is an excerpt from an article by one Dr. Robert Scranton, titled Supersession and the Echelon of Reality. In this article, Dr. Scranton posits a theory about the nature of reality, and understanding him is the first step towards understanding SCP-3812. His recursive stack theory states that there are different layers to reality, but also that no single universe is real. An easy way to think of it is to imagine a sitcom. Any sitcom you can envision will do. Between us and the fictional world of a sitcom, there are multiple observable stacked universes. Firstly, our universe, the real world as we experience it, forms the baseline. So imagine this sitting at the top of the stack. Next down in the stack comes the sitcom, a fictional universe filled with characters, which fits below our universe. Then think of what is fiction within the fiction of the sitcom. Perhaps another television show, one that only exists in the world of the sitcom but not in our own. This is the recursive stack, infinitely layered universes, and it is crucial you can envision and remember this model. Dr. Scranton's theory suggests that any universe, even our own, could potentially exist as a fictional narrative within another, wider universe. This wider universe in which ours is a fiction could also itself be a narrative within an even wider universe stacked above it, and so on. It's interesting to picture reality this way, isn't it? In fact, I'm willing to bet that you're wondering, maybe there's a universe above ours, or even one above that. Would the universe right at the top of the stack be the truly real world? And what if you could travel between each stacked reality? If you're asking any of those questions, then congratulations. You sound exactly like SCP-3812. SCP-3812 was previously known as Sam Howell. While little is known about his life, Sam was, as far as anyone knew, regarded as a fairly ordinary human being, until his death in 1996, shortly after which Sam rose from his grave and disappeared. It is unknown whether SCP-3812 simply imitated the form of Sam Howell or if they are one and the same, as this entity has been known to have the ability to change forms at will, making it hard for the Foundation to track it. It does usually maintain a humanoid appearance, however this has deteriorated somewhat over numerous decades. By now you may have already gathered that the extent of SCP-3812's abilities don't end at shapeshifting. This SCP is a powerful, aggressive, reality-altering entity. Cast your mind back to the recursive stack. SCP-3812 is able to travel upwards through these stacked universes, creating untold chaos using its plethora of world-bending abilities. As far as the SCP Foundation can tell, 3812's sole intention is to become an omnipotent force existing above any and all possible universes. In other words, the top of the stack. Aside from the ability to change shape, SCP-3812's control and alteration of reality around it is achieved by its long list of latent abilities. This entity is capable of feats far beyond that of normal humans, such as teleportation, telekinesis, and telepathy. However, SCP-3812 is also able to directly manipulate any and all aspects of reality. It can influence and alter observable forces around us, for example the manipulation of matter, energy, weather, and even gravity and other laws of physics as we know them. But the creature can also warp reality on further levels. It's able to erase people, objects, or even concepts to the point where human beings lose virtually all memory of them. With the danger that an entity this powerful poses to our reality, it's not surprising that the SCP Foundation would attempt to nullify its abilities. One attempt by the Foundation involved another unknown SCP, which created an anti-metaphysical field. This was done in the hopes that it would strip SCP-3812 of its reality warping abilities. However, the entity was unfazed. The containment attempt failed, and the remains of the unknown SCP instead resulted in the creation of SCP-239. As for the SCP-3812 entity's own origin, that is still largely unknown. But there does exist a message on a secure server in the SCP Foundation's O5 command, seemingly from another entity belonging to a reality stacked higher above our own, that appears to have created a reality much further down, one that SCP-3812 inhabited. And now it seems that SCP-3812 is climbing up the stack. There is a trade-off of sorts to the abundance of powers SCP-3812 possesses. The entity is in an almost constant state of ascension through different stacked universes, climbing higher and higher, believing every reality beneath it to be a fiction. The creature has developed multiple severe mental conditions that seem to be a direct result of overexposure to different layers of reality. This includes an advanced form of Enigman-Viator schizophrenia complex, which often manifests in extreme symptoms within the creature. SCP-3812 has been known to suffer from paranoia, dysphoria, depression, and inability to control its emotions, as well as hearing voices, seeing things that do not exist, and possessing multiple personalities. While the creature is usually aimless, SCP-3812 has been known to have random outbursts that can cause anomalies within local space and time. But thanks to it experiencing so many different layers of reality, traveling upwards through what it perceives to be fictional universes, SCP-3812 displays difficulty in separating what is real and what is imagined. In fact, reality and fiction have become one and the same to SCP-3812, because as far as it is concerned, they literally are the same. Each new reality it inhabits is just fiction for the reality stacked above it. So then how are we supposed to contain or neutralize such a powerful reality-altering creature that cannot distinguish between what is real and what is fictional? The Foundation knows that its own procedures to keep SCP-3812 contained would be ineffective. This entity, by its nature, cannot be contained. Any attempt to keep it locked away would easily be undone by any one of its numerous powers to warp reality. Locking it in a cement box at the bottom of the ocean would be pointless. It could teleport out, or turn its cell into nothing but dust. Putting it in a vat of acid to endlessly burn it would just result in it turning that acid to harmless water or air. SCP-3812 can manipulate events throughout time, and so it could easily prevent itself from ever being contained. It is even possible that any individuals, even Foundation staff who may have previously tried to lock the creature up, now no longer exist thanks to SCP-3812's abilities. And there would be no way to determine this, since we wouldn't be able to remember that the person had ever been in our reality. The Foundation's best hope is to keep SCP-3812 where it is, and hope it remains docile. If they are able to keep it away from large population centers, then the risk of 3812 having any sort of psychic influence over citizens or warping reality and causing the deaths of millions or even billions is at least reduced. But of course, it is never fully gone. On at least one occasion, SCP-3812 has caused a truly catastrophic event. For some reason, SCP-3812 decided to turn itself into a star, spinning endlessly. And it did so. Numerous anomalous occurrences took place across the world. Most notably, SCP-3812 caused the Foundation's nuclear warheads to detonate, spreading harmful radioactive material into the atmosphere. Additionally, the population of New Zealand began to sporadically disappear and reappear, looping back and forth between existence and non-existence for a period of around 5 hours. It was during this world-ending scenario that SCP-3812, still at the center of its star form, was recorded ranting, its split personalities arguing. One of the creature's personalities claimed it was unmaking the world as an act of revenge against someone. It stated that it believed,
Existence is a joke. The narrative abandoned us to be miserable, and we are breaking the narrative.
Its other half mentioned another entity known only as Ben, and seemed to imply that this entity was responsible for SCP-3812's creation in a reality stacked above this one. According to the more rational of 3812's two halves, this Ben entity deemed us unfit to rest peacefully, to slip into the darkness quietly. He made a game of us. It then went on to convince this other half that destroying this reality just to slight Ben would be pointless. There would always be another, stacked on top infinitely.
So why does this narrative mean anything to you?
It asked.
It is one of an eternity to others. It is not special. It is not particular.
The two sides of SCP-3812 argued with each other, one wanting to destroy all of reality to spite Ben, driven mad by witnessing trillions upon trillions of universes stacked atop each other. The other half of 3812 saw peace for itself, ascending above these infinitely stacked universes, finally reaching the top and becoming free. Not a god, a star rising in the east, rising away from this all until we are little more than a memory of a song.
It will be lonely.
the other half of the creature replied. We'll have each other, SCP-3812's other personality said.
I'm afraid,
said the one intent on destruction. I am too, the other reassured it. But that is no reason to destroy this narrative. Eventually, SCP-3812's personalities reached agreement. They both left the narrative they were currently in, presumably traveling upwards to one stacked above our own, while simultaneously remaining in this universe. Still a danger. Let go of this world. Let him rewrite it back to what it was. We aren't part of this anymore. Shortly after this event, reality shifted once more, and the entire world reverted back to how it had been before. Records of the end-of-the-world scenario that had occurred were retained by high-level administrators and the O5 Council, perhaps as a reminder of the destructive capabilities of the creature, a warning of its potential to change this reality and any stacked below or above it. Fortunately, since this incident, SCP-3812 has remained in its docile, aimless state, no longer actively hostile to anyone that approaches it. It has kept its amorphous star-like shape, and is still very much able to create disruptions and anomalies in reality. Despite keeping SCP-3812 constantly monitored at its current location in the South Pacific Ocean, the SCP Foundation knows that, at any time, this entity could trigger yet another global catastrophe, causing massive damage to planet Earth, its population, and beyond that, tearing our reality itself asunder. So we all just better hope our narrative remains worthwhile to SCP-3812's better half. It all started in 1983 with reports of human trafficking in the heart of Sin City. The FBI had gotten word of a potential trafficking ring operating out of an abandoned department store in Las Vegas, Nevada, and immediately began organizing a secret raid on the building. While they would indeed encounter something horrifying within that abandoned department store, it wasn't criminals or human trafficking. In fact, it wasn't human at all. This is the horrifying story of SCP-847. After weeks of planning, the raid on the department store was conducted in the dead of night. Agents covered all the exits and entrances, and a helicopter was stationed nearby in case anyone attempted to run. It should have been a perfect trap, but things never go as planned when you don't know what you're dealing with. The agents breached the door and began searching the darkened building. It didn't appear that there was any power, so the traffickers must have had great night vision and a high tolerance for creepy locales. Agents soon heard a faint humming sound coming from below, a generator. It must be located in the basement and be the hub of this criminal enterprise. Readying themselves for whatever they were about to find, the agents descended into the basement. As they moved deeper into the building, they found that lighting rigs had been set up. They must be getting closer to something, but that something was still a mystery. A senior FBI special agent was leading the charge, his pistol drawn and ready. It was quiet, too quiet. Did the traffickers already realize they were coming and clear out? He was ready to consider this bust a bust when he heard a quiet mewling in the distance, a persistent whining whimper that was undeniably human. He gave the signal to his fellow agents to follow the noise. They proceeded forward towards the pain sounds and found themselves in a wide, well-lit room filled with department store mannequins. All were broken to some degree. Some were totally smashed to pieces. Some were chained to walls and locked in cages. Others were wrapped in plastic. The agent wondered whether this was some kind of twisted joke or a messed up avant-garde art piece. That's when he noticed her. A single crouched figure in the distance, hunched over and whimpering in a darkened corner of the room near a full-length mirror. He couldn't fully make her out, but he got the sense that something was wrong. She was injured, bent over. Was she even missing an arm? Just what had these monsters done to this woman? He whispered a request for backup into his radio and pushed on. When he got within 50 meters of this strange woman, her demeanor changed entirely. She jerked around, her movements forced, erratic, and painful looking. The woman stared directly into the agent's eyes and began hobbling towards him, occasionally stopping to strike a pose as if modeling during a photo shoot. Just then, the agent made a horrifying realization. This thing moving towards them wasn't a woman at all. It was a living mannequin. As she got closer though, he realized that the mannequin's broken left forearm had been carved into a large shiv. A female junior FBI agent had been one of the many to pour into the room when the raid leader had radioed for backup. The second she entered the 50-meter range of this strange mannequin, everything changed. In an instant, its eyes and mouth began dripping with a thick, viscous resin. Its whimpering gasps suddenly became vicious, ear-splitting screeches, and it turned its gaze from the senior FBI agent. It was now focused on the junior agent, who had just entered the room and broke into a terrifying run straight towards her. The mannequin moved with a violent, single-minded purpose. Other agents began firing, but it was running freakishly fast and easily dodged most of the bullets. The few that actually hit seemed to do nothing to slow the creature down. It shrugged off the damage and kept running. With a great leap, it landed on the terrified junior agent and began jabbing her with its bladed arm. The other agents stopped firing, fearing they might accidentally hit their colleague during the panic. The mannequin was ruthless, clawing and stabbing with the strange resin leaking out of its every orifice. Terrified and unable to reach her gun, the agent remembered her training. She reached into her belt and grabbed her stun gun, jamming the 2 probes up against the creature's chest and giving it 30,000 volts. The creature spasmed, fell backwards, and collapsed in a heap on the ground, frozen. This was the first recorded encounter with SCP-847, a violent living mannequin with a serious problem with women. This terrifying report was passed up the chain of command until it landed on the desk of a Foundation agent working in the FBI. The Foundation quickly swooped in and claimed the mannequin, delivered necessary amnestic treatment to all who'd witnessed it, and closely observed the female junior FBI agent's recovery in a private hospital with Foundation ties. As it turns out, they were right to do so, as the junior agent was in for a gruesome fate. While the wound she'd suffered at the hands of SCP-847 didn't appear fatal, the fact that the mannequin's anomalous resin excretions entered the open wound changed everything. Several hours after being committed, the junior agent began complaining of limb stiffness and difficulty moving. This quickly developed into full paralysis. Over time, her skin and internal organs began to harden, until the process, dubbed plastination, came to a gruesome end. The junior agent wasn't just dead, she had been transformed into a mannequin. Foundation researchers were met with a truly horrifying realization. This means that all the other broken mannequins found with SCP-847 were likely once living humans, attacked and transformed by the anomaly, now a source for new harvested body parts. Now safely interred at a Foundation containment facility though, the real tests on SCP-847 to determine its behavior and physical attributes could begin. The most important detail about SCP-847 is that its aggression is exclusively directed towards women, as opposed to when it encounters men, and its instincts are more self-destructive. Through a series of tests and observations, researchers have been able to pin down 3 different distinct patterns of behavior for SCP-847. Pattern Z behaviors occur when there are no humans standing within 50 meters of SCP-847. The mannequin will seek out a full-length mirror and pose in front of it, much like a department store mannequin attempting to show off its clothes. It remains largely inanimate during these periods, and will very occasionally use a finger, or whatever appendage is available, given its habit for self-mutilation, to scratch messages on nearby surfaces. Pattern Y behavior occurs when male humans with XY chromosomes enter a 50-meter radius around SCP-847. Just like its reaction to the male FBI agents who found it, 847 will initially emit vocalizations that seem like whimpering gasps, before making eye contact and striking provocative poses while approaching the subject. It will then remain static and allow the male subject to pose its body. However, after the male subject leaves the area, 847 will enter a state of considerable distress and begin removing or shattering parts of its body. The Foundation has found that the parts removed or shattered are often consistent with parts that the male subjects found displeasing during interactions, showing a masochistic desire to impress. These parts are then harvested back from plastinated victims, which brings us to the most dangerous of its behavior patterns. Pattern X behaviors occur when female humans enter a 50-meter radius around the creature. 847 will immediately become brutally aggressive, switching its noises from whimpers to violent screeches and growls. 847 experiences enhanced physical capabilities during Pattern X states. Its speed has been measured at 45 kilometers per hour, making it as fast as the legendary SCP-096. It's also been shown to exhibit extreme physical strength. It's during this pattern of behavior that it begins excreting its deadly resin, which has been proven to only be dangerous to women. In these states, the only thing capable of reliably pacifying the being is a powerful electric shock. The shock causes the creature's resin to harden, temporarily incapacitating it for roughly 5 minutes. Other conventional weapons and damage has no meaningful effect on SCP-847. After a number of incidents that had sad and violent endings, the Foundation Ethics Committee forbade the use of female D-Class personnel in SCP-847 testing. When it came to female subjects, 847 always slipped into a state of extreme aggression, so instead the Foundation began testing with male subjects in hopes of better understanding the dynamics between human males and SCP-847. Various misogynistic D-Class males were introduced into the containment chamber, which was modeled to look like a bedroom for the purposes of behavioral study. Each one, either during or after their interaction with SCP-847, was told to comment on some aspect they felt dissatisfied with. The mannequin shattered its own chest after hearing it described as being out of proportion. After another D-Class called its nose ugly, the mannequin broke it off. After another said that its hair was out of fashion and commented on its inability to drink, it tore out its hair and liver. All parts were replaced after the experiments. Things took their most violent and upsetting turn yet with the introduction of D-7294. A lot of the time, D-Class personnel are considered to be as anonymous as they are expendable, but D-7294 is an exception. Before becoming D-Class, he was a successful cello teacher who brutally murdered one of his teenage students and her mother. He's typically employed in tests when the Foundation wishes to see interactions between anomalies and humans with confirmed psychopathic personalities. During his interaction with SCP-847, he belittled and humiliated the mannequin. He forced it into uncomfortable poses and even snapped off one of its fingers before being dragged from the room by Foundation guards. In the following debrief, he further berated the mannequin as useless and lousy at its job of being controlled by him. In response, 847 extracted its own brains, eyes, and clavicle before shattering its own hands in dismay. So why does 847 behave this way? While it may appear monstrous, it seems that the reason SCP-847 does what it does is all too human. It hurts women because it itself is hurting, and it's willing to hurt itself even more for the approval of the objects of its desire. As a result, it's an anomaly trapped in an endless cycle of pain and violence. Perhaps one day, it'll be able to free itself from the loop, but that day is unlikely to come for this murderous mannequin anytime soon. Some things are best kept contained. After all, this is the founding principle behind the SCP Foundation themselves, to secure and contain the most dangerous anomalies in order to protect human lives. But within the Foundation itself are things which should never be uncovered, secrets that must never be told. Secured behind multiple layers of containment like the 7 Seals of Revelation is a threat so high level in its nature that it can't even be given a class. SCP-5999. But in order to truly understand this late series SCP, we have to go all the way back to one of the earliest. Anyone looking for SCP-001 will quickly realize that there are several different entities and anomalies that share this designation. Many reasons have been given for this classification quirk. Perhaps they were all discovered in the early days of the Foundation, before the current numbering system was introduced. Others have suggested that many different SCP-001s are an intentional misdirection by the Foundation to keep the nature of the true first SCP a closely guarded secret. One of the many entities, and the one we'll be referring to as SCP-001 to understand SCP-5999, is otherwise known as the database. Information about the database is kept a secret to the entire SCP Foundation, apart from the Overseer Council. The reason behind this? Well, that would be because this SCP-001 contains details of the very nature of the Foundation itself, including its creation. Not how the organization was founded, mind you, how it was created, and by whom. We're about to break the most powerful layer of containment of all, the fourth wall. You see, to you or I, the SCP Foundation and its vast catalog of user-generated articles on the creative and the creepy are nothing more than a source of entertainment. It can be fun to study the lore and the nuances of different SCPs, appreciating the imagination and hard work that the authors put into writing them. It can even inspire us, fuel our own written endeavors, whether that takes the form of fan fiction, independent stories, original SCPs, or even a YouTube series. But when all is said and done, we all know that the SCP Foundation is fictional, and they know it too. Pieced together from various fragments of information within their own archives, the database contains everything the Foundation knows about the real-world authors of the SCP Wiki. Just like we told you, it's time to wave a fond farewell to the fourth wall, the metaphorical barrier that separates what we know to be real from what we know to be purely fiction. The fact that they exist in this fictional capacity is something the Overseer Council hopes to hide from the rest of the Foundation's personnel. But they also have plans in mind for the SCP Wiki writers responsible for creating them and expanding the roster of anomalies they keep contained. The SCP Wiki entry on SCP-001, the database, closes with a proposal, a plan from the O5 Council to reach the Wiki's authors in the real world, through mimetic kill agents that will put them to sleep and then kill them. With that important background context in mind, now let's go all the way back to the other end of the SCP Wiki and take a look at SCP-5999. When first accessing the file, you, the reader, will notice a few format differences between this entry and others within the SCP archive. Each section of SCP-5999 is hidden behind an encryption, and accessing these will reveal the different levels of this entry. Remember how we mentioned the 7 seals of Revelation at the start of this video? That wasn't a coincidence. In the Bible's Book of Revelation, there are 7 symbolic seals securing a book that John of Patmos saw in his vision of the apocalypse. When these 7 seals are broken and the book is opened, this symbolizes the second coming of the Messiah and marks the beginning of the biblical apocalypse. In much the same vein, SCP-5999 is sealed in 7 different parts, each behind its own encryption, culminating in one apocalyptic ending. So at this point you're probably thinking, what actually is SCP-5999? What could be so dangerous that it has to stay hidden in multiple segments? Well, on the surface, SCP-5999 is just a story. It details one of the SCP Foundation's many investigations into an anomalous object. Nothing too strange about that. But there's something more to it, since with the Foundation there always is. And it has something to do with the images at the header of each section of the entity. At the top of each part of SCP-5999 is a picture of a group of candles, 7 to be exact. But the further down you read, one by one the candles start to go out, until you reach the end of SCP-5999. Delving into the first of these sections, the SCP-5999 entry describes a corpse that seems to be cursed with multiple anomalous properties. After the assault and murder of one Miss Jacqueline Hallcroft, her remains were scattered. According to this entry, any person coming into contact with a part of Miss Hallcroft's deceased body, or anyone who learns about what caused her death, will experience anomalous effects. These manifest in various ways. For example, subjects may hallucinate that they see a disheveled woman with wounds similar to Miss Hallcroft's before her dismemberment. This sight is sometimes accompanied by sounds of whispering, and even begging that calls the subject seeing and hearing things by their name. Others have reported hearing an unknown song set to the tune of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. The anomalous influence of Miss Hallcroft's dismembered remains is known to continue until a subject's death, with many reporting seeing the woman's deceased body lurking in their old photos, or suffering sleep paralysis as they feel something being forcibly removed from their guts. Some subjects even report discovering body parts and organs, anything from fingers to eyes to teeth to hair, and finding it at random places, such as when opening a drawer or in their food. Finally, a number of subjects affected by the remains of Miss Holcroft have reported a specific irrational fear, the fear that the chains are weakening. Even after the Foundation recovered Jacqueline Holcroft's bones and her remains were buried in a proper funeral, the effects that her dead body parts had over living subjects did not stop. Subjects reported their children went missing, and the attendees at Miss Holcroft's funeral were somehow spontaneously disemboweled after the ceremony. To keep these effects to a minimum, the Foundation apparently has a containment procedure in place. The SCP-5999 entry details something called Procedure Sevenfold, wherein the SCP Foundation gathers 7 civilians and brings them to a location called Albright Manor. On October 30th, these 7 people are sedated and awake on the night of October 31st. All entrances to Albright Manor are sealed, trapping the civilians inside. Observed via a network of surveillance devices throughout the manor, Procedure Sevenfold always results in the deaths of the 7 civilian witnesses brought in by the Foundation. Whether they are told to perform a ritual or offered as a sacrifice is unclear. The following morning, Foundation cleanup crews will remove the remains of these people, disposing of their bodies with an incinerator. For the rest of the year, until Procedure Sevenfold needs to be conducted again, Foundation personnel on site at Albright Manor are instructed to be careful around any surfaces that contain the phrase, "This is where I died." By now, you are most likely wondering what the remains of Miss Holcroft and Procedure Sevenfold have to do with anything we've talked about so far. What is the connection to SCP-001, the database? Is there something linking an anomalous corpse with the Foundation's knowledge of its own fictional existence? What does a fear of the chains weakening mean? And why do none of these questions seem to acknowledge what those 7 candles represent or why they're still gradually going out? Scrolling further through SCP-5999 doesn't seem to yield many more answers though. In fact, the more of the sections you look into, the less it seems to be about Miss Holcroft or even make any link to the database. And the deeper you go, the fewer candles remain lit. The next few portions of the SCP-5999 entry are dedicated to completely different investigations that have little to nothing to do with Procedure Sevenfold. Miss Holcroft's corpse and the anomalous effects it creates are also absent in later segments of this entry in the SCP archive. So if the cursed body parts of Jacqueline Holcroft are not SCP-5999, then what is? One report details the fates of a mobile task force trapped in a fog-shrouded town. Here they encounter a lamb that appears to be undead and evolves into an ungodly winged beast before the MTF team's very eyes. Another that follows is a transcript of an exorcism. During a classified Foundation operation, one Agent Grace was possessed by a demonic entity and sent to the Department of Demonology. Specialist in demonic psychology Dr. Peter McNeil attempted to remove the demon inhabiting Agent Grace. However, after trying to intimidate the demonic entity with various passages from biblical texts, it appears as though maybe the demon was able to spread its influence to both Agent Grace and Dr. McNeil. Of course, neither of these reports seem to answer any of the pressing questions or explain the exact nature of SCP-5999. As you go further into the entry, you can't help but notice how often chains are referenced. In fact, that seems to be the only thing constant in all these disjointed segments. Mentions of a failure of the chains to hold what lies beneath, and chains that have become too few in number to hold it, all create the sense that something once was locked up, sealed securely away, is managing to break free. Then finally, as the last candle goes out, you are literally brought face to face with the horror of SCP-5999, and its true nature is revealed to you. A decaying, desiccated corpse stares out of the screen at you. Its eyes are sunken deep into its skull, lips shriveled almost completely away, exposing rows of rotten teeth. Could it be Miss Holcroft's body? You aren't sure. What you are sure of is the corpse's face is getting closer to the screen, and now it's smiling at you. You can feel your heart pounding, beating against your ribcage. As the world around you begins to fade and your life slips away from you, the last thing you see is the grim face of the corpse staring out at you with its dead, sunken eyes. The truth of SCP-5999 is that it has been specifically designed to kill whoever reads it. By whom, you may be asking? By the SCP Foundation themselves. Cast your mind back to the database and remember that the Overseer Council are aware of their own fictional existence. They know that they aren't real, and plan to use a memetic kill agent to take out the SCP wiki authors that created them. SCP-5999 is that kill agent, an entity created by fiction to kill those living in reality. SCP-5999 works by drawing a person in, offering disjointed and disconnected horror stories as a means of grabbing a reader's attention. Further and further down through the entry that person will go, searching for the meaning behind these chilling tales, and therein lies the trap. Each layer, each section of SCP-5999 that you read is another candle extinguished, and with every flame that goes out, a seal is broken, a chain becomes unbound, allowing the entity contained within the archive entry itself to get closer. Its sole purpose is to fulfill the proposal laid out by the O5 Council, after learning that they were fictional, along with the entire SCP universe. By pulling you in with the mystery and intrigue of the confusing, convoluted stories, SCP-5999 is able to deploy, jumping out of the screen towards you, condemning you to a dark and grisly fate. Or maybe that's just what the O5 Council and the SCP Foundation wants us to think. Either way, it might just be safer to get your SCP knowledge here at SCP Explained. You're a pizza delivery person for a company we're not at liberty to name. It may seem like a thankless job, but you're part of the thin crust between satisfaction and starvation for people who really don't feel like cooking or going out tonight. You're a tried and true pizza veteran. You've seen a lot on the job. From people who try to rob you on their own doorsteps to one guy who tried to tip you with a clearly fake Rolex. But you haven't seen anything like the insanity you're about to encounter tonight. That's because you're about to get sick. Really, really sick. And we know there's probably a lot of diseases you'd rather not catch. But trust us, no disease bites quite like SCP-3760. But back to you. You're parked on the saddle of your prized bicycle, pedaling for your life. The biggest order you've ever delivered strapped to the cargo rack behind you. 8 large meat feast pizzas. You figure you're heading towards the most hopping or at least the hungriest party in the city. And despite the frustration of needing to ferry this hot, cheesy nightmare to its destination, parties have historically been pretty good tippers. Little do you know, your prized customer is about to give you much more than just a tip. You pull outside their ground-level apartment and park your bike. There's no music coming from the apartment you're heading to. Strange. You pick up your precious cargo and trudge towards the door, barely managing to ring the bell with your spare pinky. The door swings open instantly, as though the occupant was just standing behind it the whole time, waiting for you. When the door opens, you're not sure what to make of what you see inside. There isn't a party. There doesn't even seem to be a group. Just one person standing there and staring at you. And something about this person is just wrong. His skin seems to be an oddly unnatural color. It has a slightly gray hue, like it's rotting, and you see that the stranger's shirt is torn in several places. You're trying your best to remain professional and not stare, but you notice that whatever is under these tears doesn't look like skin. It's almost like there are holes all over his body underneath the shirt. Big, gaping holes. And are those? You're cut off when he takes the pile of pizzas from you and shoves what was once a handful of dollars into your palm. They seem torn up, and worst of all, wet. You look past your strange customer and see that his apartment looks just as shoddy as he does. There's stuffing torn from the couch, huge tears in the curtains. What you could swear are scratch or bite marks on some of the wooden furniture. This man clearly needed his pizza. As you begin to step away, happy to just be rid of this freaky situation, you do something that you'll live to regret. Just for a moment, you lock eyes with the customer. There's something about them that makes you feel sick. They're wet and black, more like a doll's eyes than anything that should belong to a human. Just that one instant of contact is enough to chill your bones. And according to some theories around SCP-3760, it may have been the moment of your infection. As the stranger closes the door in your face, presumably to eat his obscene number of pizzas, you stumble back to your bicycle, letting your torn-up, gooey tip blow away in the wind. Getting out of this place is rewarding enough, but you can't chase the thoughts of the stranger out of your mind. Was he sick? Was he even human? These are the thoughts swimming through your head as you cycle back to the restaurant. You're so preoccupied you don't even notice the truck speeding towards you. You get sideswiped, destroying your bike and throwing you in the air. You can feel the snap of your arm breaking as you land. It's a horrible feeling to go along with the horrible noise. And as you fade from consciousness, the last thought in your mind is the black, soulless eyes of the customer. When you wake up, you'll find that you're in a hospital bed with your arm in a cast. The doctors tell you that you're phenomenally lucky to be alive given the severity of the crash. The doctor says that you're dealing with a compound fracture in your right arm, as well as some nasty cuts that required stitches, but otherwise, you're fine. The hospital insists that you at least stay the night though, and you oblige. But that night, you find it's difficult to sleep. Partially because of the pain, but mostly because of an extremely strange sound coming from inside the cast around your arm. It's a scraping noise, like something sharp scratching at the interior. You figure it must just be some strange side effect of the pain meds. You're not going to let worry eat you up on the inside. Something else will be doing that soon enough. You're discharged from the hospital the next day and told that you should be fine in a couple of months, as though that's some kind of consolation. You try to carry on with your daily life as much as you can with one arm out of commission, but that awful crunching noise from inside your cast persists. You even start to become paranoid that some sort of insect is trapped inside, or worse, a swarm of insects. But you aren't left with that uncertainty for long. By the next morning, your cast has fallen off. Well, not fallen, per se. A more accurate description would be that it was chewed off from the inside. And not by something trapped in there with your arm, but by your arm itself. When you finally see it, it doesn't even look like an arm anymore. The flesh has turned gray, that same sickly gray of the customer's skin the night of your accident. But worse still, from the top of the hand down to the base of the forearm, your entire arm is split open into a fang-lined, chattering mouth. When you've gotten over the initial horror of seeing the mutations that have taken hold of your arm, you notice something about the teeth in the second mouth. They're nothing like human teeth. They're vicious, jagged triangles, each one like a dagger. These are unmistakably shark's teeth. You give yourself the luxury of having a good scream. After all, what else are you supposed to do after you find your arm has turned into some kind of fleshy shark mutant? You notice that you can hardly even feel the snapping of its jaws, like it isn't even really a part of you. And as much as you try to tense and release what used to be the tendons in your forearm, there is no change. For all intents and purposes, that limb is no longer yours. It just happens to be attached to you. Not only that, but it's always very, very hungry, as quickly became evident from the fact it made such short work of the cast that had been containing it not long ago. You can see that the graying flesh is beginning to spread from your forearm to your bicep. It's almost like little by little, your tissue is being switched. Somehow you're innately aware that if you don't feed your arm, it'll get even worse. Suddenly, everything about the strange customer from the night of the accident makes sense. He had whatever you have now, only worse. He was just hoping that the pizzas would keep the beast at bay, and you very much hope the contents of your fridge will do the same. Wasting no time, you grab some processed ham and raw chicken. You're not an idiot. You know that if this thing is anything like a real shark, it's only going to be interested in meat. But when you shove the processed meat into the nibbling maw in your forearm, you notice that it seems to spit the food out. Something tells you that your offering was too dead. Now you're really afraid. Will this thing want live prey? Will that be the only way to stop it from taking the rest of your arm or even more? The thought terrifies you. It's like being Venom, except you don't even get a new alien friend or any cool superpowers for your trouble, but you're smart. You're resourceful. You don't intend to let this thing take over your life without a fight, and you've always believed what G.I. Joe taught you. Knowing is half the battle. Sadly, doing an internet search for "my injury is somehow mutating into a shark, how do I stop this?" didn't do much good. And you don't want to go to a doctor, because part of you expects to be immediately shipped off to the nearest circus or military research lab. Instead, you throw on a thick leather jacket that you hope your new shark arm will take a while to eat through, and head to the library of the nearest medical college. If anywhere has sources on the most obscure of medical problems, this would be the place. And after hours of searching through index cards, you find it. What seems to be the one and only source of this ludicrous topic in the thousands and thousands of books. A series of journal entries made by Dr. Keith Woodward, ship's medical officer aboard the USS Kirby, circa 1922. Even the library's indexing system prefaces the source with a disclaimer that it's likely 25% quackery and 75% ocean madness. But that doesn't deter you. Any port in a storm. Dr. Woodward told the horrifying tale of the USS Kirby's collapse due to a sudden and unexplainable contagion. It began with the infection of a sailor on the ship named Willis Riggs, who'd fallen overboard and had his foot partially eaten by a shark. Much like your arm, the man's foot slowly became the ravenous, all-devouring mouth of a shark itself. Little by little, it spread to the other crew members through unknown means. Any injuries sustained by the crew didn't heal like normal, but instead became this vicious living shark tissue. Soon, these ever-hungry new mouths led them to eat each other, and then themselves from the inside out. Even after the humans they once were could be considered long dead, those hungry jaws kept snapping. There was no cure. There was no solution. Everyone on the boat was recorded as having mysteriously died at sea. That is the curse of SCP-3760. And as if on cue, you look down to see that the shark's mouth in your arm has chewed through the leather of your sleeve like it's nothing. It's hungry, and nothing will satiate it. But perhaps some sacrifices need to be made if you want to stop it from getting worse. Just as the thought crosses your mind, a needle full of sedative is injected into your neck. Everything goes dark very quickly, and when you wake up, you're in a clean, clinical white room. You are now officially under containment by the SCP Foundation. Not that you'll know that anytime soon. This may seem like the cavalry has arrived, but sadly for your sake, they have no interest in curing you. They're just eager to gather more data on how your condition progresses. SCP-3760 exists as a latent infection in well over half of humanity, but its horrific mutating effects are activated in only a relative few. There have only been 2,785 recorded cases of SCP-3760 activity observed between 1958 and 2016. This is thanks to the Foundation's secret weapon against the shark mutation menace, Subliminal Mimetic Agent Kappa Omicron, or SMA-KO, a widely distributed mimetic agent that suppresses the symptoms of infection in most people. Not that this would provide much comfort to you, as you join the almost 3,000 others who have been infected, and you are doomed to slowly turn into an abomination in your containment chamber. If it's any consolation, you may not see the truly advanced stages of the disease. The most common cause of death among the afflicted is being eaten by their own ravenous shark mouths long before it changes your entire body. Actually, come to think of it, that's not much of a consolation at all. But hey, when it comes to anomalous mutations, we're sad to report that there's rarely a happy ending in store for those afflicted, and SCP-3760 is no exception to the rule. An SCP Foundation researcher is monitoring the salt content of a large tank filled with water. Inside the tank, just under the surface, is a huge mass of rusted metal. Though few pieces have a couple specks of their original shiny surface visible through the dark red exterior. The researcher suddenly looks up from his task though. Does anyone else hear that noise? It's a terrible noise, like metal scraping and scratching against each other. But the heap of metal in the tank isn't moving. Still, the noises continue though, and the researcher keeps staring at the unmoving hunk of metal in the tank. All he can think about is diving in and letting his body become a part of it. Kept submerged in a big saltwater tank at the SCP Foundation is an object, but perhaps a more accurate way to describe it would be as a machine. Referred to as SCP-882, the machine's containment tank is required, according to containment procedures, to be filled with at least 40% pure seawater direct from the ocean. If at any point the rusty surface of SCP-882 begins to show signs of becoming more like shiny metal, then the percentage of seawater must be raised to 100% until the metal is completely covered in rust. Trying to keep metal rusted? That might sound like a strange concept, but you'll see why it's so necessary soon. SCP-882 looks like little more than a collection of seemingly random pieces of metal, all fused together as if they had been welded. Gears, cables, pulleys, screws, and belts, all different shapes and sizes, all made of different metals. All of these various components do not appear to be uniform or have been made to fit each other, and are instead all stuck together in one big, unstructured mass of metal objects. But SCP-882 wasn't built to be like this. Instead, this seems to be the result of one of SCP-882's latent anomalous properties, the absorption of metal. Any metal that comes into contact with SCP-882 will become permanently attached to it, and after a few days will be a new part of SCP-882. That means that any metal that touches that new piece will also become a part of SCP-882 and on and on. Because of this strange property, absolutely no metal is allowed to be brought near SCP-882, and only organic materials are permitted to come into direct contact with it. That includes using non-metal alternatives to keep the machine securely contained. SCP-882 is suspended in its saltwater tank by organic cotton fiber lines, which also require changing on a daily basis. Any and all researchers that the SCP Foundation has interacting with the metallic mass are required to wear thick cotton gloves at all times. You might think that this sounds pretty easy to contain. Just don't let it touch metal? No problem. Organic materials only. No removal of rust allowed? No sweat. The Foundation staff working with 882 probably felt the same way, until they started hearing SCP-882 make noise. While SCP-882 is usually silent, personnel that spend an extended period of time close to the machine have reported intense grinding or clicking noises coming from somewhere in the mess of metal components. While they start out low and are almost unnoticeable, these sounds get gradually louder until eventually they become completely unbearable for human beings to withstand. So then why don't these sounds show up on audio recordings? Because the grinding or clicking noises from SCP-882 are, in actually, extreme auditory hallucinations. But even though they aren't real, these sounds are more than capable of driving anyone who hears them into a state of psychosis. And here's where things get tricky. The only way to make the noises stop is to offer SCP-882 more metal. As mentioned, any object that is made of any type of metal that comes into contact with the machine becomes a part of its mass. Allowing new objects to become fused to the surface of SCP-882 will cause the grinding noises to subside, but will increase SCP-882's mass permanently. If the noises aren't stopped though, then the mental state of those afflicted by them only grows worse. And some victims of SCP-882's auditory hallucinations have gone so far as to throw themselves into the tank containing it, where they were killed almost immediately, their bodies crushed to death by anomalous forces and becoming unrecoverable from the tangle of gears and random metal objects. The SCP Foundation now requires any of its personnel that work directly with SCP-882 to report any instances of noise coming from the machine. Additionally, whoever reports hearing strange sounds in the vicinity of SCP-882 must turn themselves in for a full psychological evaluation. Depending on the results, the researcher will either be free to return to their work or will face containment themselves at an undisclosed Foundation facility. The surface of SCP-882 exhibits an extreme resistance to damage. According to the Foundation's testing, the metal structure has a tensile strength and toughness stronger than aircraft-grade titanium alloy. Despite this, the machine still seems to be constructed of weaker metals like tin, iron, gold, and many others still yet to be identified. It takes extreme heat and several hours of exposure at that to cut even the smallest portion of metal from the main bulk of SCP-882. But where did it come from? The SCP Foundation first recovered SCP-882 near an island commonly on the northeast coast of Banks Island, one of the larger islands in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Strangely, not a single scrap of metal Not even underground metallic ore was found within a 1-mile radius of where the machine was discovered. Stranger still, the small town located nearby seemed to be abandoned, with signs that it had been devoid of any human life for quite a number of years. The collection of fused metal components, later designated SCP-882, was found submerged in seawater. The machine was coated in rust, and the Foundation has chosen to keep it in the same rusty state it has been kept in since its containment. Why? Because when Foundation personnel first attempted to remove SCP-882 from the water, and the rust began to flake away from SCP-882's metal surface, its gears and cogs started to turn. Foundation personnel on site were unsure of what the machine's purpose was, but wanted to halt it in case it proved deadly. A number of ill-fated attempts at containment occurred soon after, with any person getting too close to SCP-882 finding themselves pulled into its mass and crushed to death between turning cogs. After multiple accidents that resulted in the demise of Foundation personnel, Dr. Charles Gears authorized the use of SCP-2519 to help stop the movement of SCP-882's gears. SCP-2519 is an audio file titled Babylon MP3, which features the song By the Waters of Babylon by Philip Hayes and text from the biblical Psalm 137. Playing this file can cause malfunctions to occur in various electronic and mechanical devices, normally reducing the speed at which they can operate or causing a complete cessation of a machine's function. In SCP-882's case, the sound of Babylon MP3 successfully slowed the machine's moving parts, allowing Foundation personnel to safely get closer to it. Teams then cut the massive metal down to a more manageable size with extreme heat, and it was finally contained. However, another question arises. Surely if SCP-882 is a machine, then it must have a purpose, right? And perhaps more importantly, what is its connection to the infamous machine-loving group of interest, the Church of the Broken God? Both of these questions might just have one easy answer. To put it plain and simple, SCP-882 may just be the heart of the Broken God. The Church of the Broken God is a religious organization that the SCP Foundation has had a number of encounters with over the years. Members of the church share in the belief that life, specifically biological flesh-based life, is inherently wrong, even evil. This group worships mechanization, the process of making something or someone more mechanical in nature. According to the beliefs of the church, there were two gods, Yaldabaoth and Mannequin, who created humanity together. Yaldabaoth was the god of flesh and animal instinct, granting humans their bodies, while Mannequin, the god of machine and intellect, blessed man with the power of free thought. As humankind developed and its civilization began building machines, Yaldabaoth became enraged that they were ignoring the instincts she had bestowed upon them. She endeavored to destroy the creations of man, in an attempt to revert them to the animals she had intended to be. As legend goes, Mannequin acted as humanity's savior and intervened to stop Yaldabaoth. The god of machine shattered himself, transforming his body into a number of pieces to form a cage for his fellow god. Fragments of Mannequin rained down on planet Earth, fragments that the Church of the Broken God believes it is their duty to recover. However, a number of these pieces are cataloged as SCPs that the Foundation is either aware of or has in containment. They are SCP-882, or His Broken Heart to the Church, SCP-271, His Broken Gift, SCP-813, His Broken Eyes, SCP-1139, His Broken Tongue, SCP-635, His Broken Mind, and finally, His Broken Blood, which refers to SCP-217. Often using anomalous technology, members of the Church of the Broken God intend to uncover or steal these various components. The Church's ultimate goal is to bring the correct pieces together and completely restore Mannequin's form. It is their hope that he will guide them to intellectual enlightenment and bless them with new mechanical forms so that they can discard their current flesh and blood bodies. However, the Foundation and the Church are certainly not the only groups to have a fascination with SCP-882. Near the Banks Island site where the machine was first discovered, Foundation personnel encountered a man, the sole survivor of the nearby town. This individual, by the name of Richard Wright, was apprehended and brought in for questioning with Dr. Gears. During their interview, Richard revealed a number of details about the townsfolk who had first uncovered SCP-882 and what ultimately became of them. According to his account, the community formed a cult around SCP-882 after a man named Alan found it. The machine's parts had begun to turn and move, but with no clear indication as to what was powering it. Soon, a local priest, Father Pat, also took an interest in SCP-882. Both he and Alan seemed to share the belief that the machine had been built by God for a higher purpose, and encouraged residents of the nearby town to come and offer metal to it. Richard explained that the locals were plagued by the auditory hallucinations typical of long-term exposure to SCP-882, kept awake at all hours of the night by clanking, grinding, and the screaming of metal. Before long, Richard noticed more and more metal items being fed to the machine, with many local residents content to just sit and stare at the mass. He also noticed that Father Pat and Alan both seemed to be acting strangely around the machine, insisting that all the metal that had been added to it still wasn't enough. Then one night, during a communion before SCP-882, Father Pat took a pair of pliers and began tearing out townspeople's metal fillings. Richard watched in horror as the priest wrenched teeth from the mouths of ordinary people and threw them into SCP-882, but still claiming it wasn't enough. Then he turned on Alan, accusing him of hiding metal from the great machine inside his body. The townsfolk turned on Alan, the first one to find SCP-882, and threw him and his metal hip into the machine, his body breaking under its moving parts. Luckily, SCP-882 remains contained, at least for now, until the members of the Church of the Broken God find a way to reunite the heart of their god with the other pieces of its scattered body, and Mannequin can rise again, an outcome that his worshippers are eager to bring to fruition, sooner rather than later.
One fine morning, your distant Aunt Carol came to your family home in an almost frantic state of excitement. Carol had always been a bit eccentric, totally harmless, of course, but what you'd describe as being on the more zealous side of religious. Predictably, she wanted to ask you and your family to come to church with her. Seeing as you don't see Aunt Carol often, you and your family decide that there's no harm in indulging her. You're not an atheist family by any means. In fact, you were all raised Catholic, but it felt like it'd been forever since you last went to church. Aunt Carol wanted to show you and your family the special celebrations that went on at her church. You remember her practically grabbing you by the wrist and dragging you to the building, her eyes filled with a crazed enthusiasm. That's when you saw something incredibly strange. There were shadows moving behind the elaborate stained glass windows, thousands of tiny shadows darting around, and this low humming noise you faintly recognized. What was that noise? It was the cry of cicadas, but this was only early spring. What were cicadas doing awake at this time of year? You didn't get much time to ponder this question. In the next few seconds, you and the entire church were surrounded by heavy-duty tactical vehicles. What appeared to be a large and heavily armed SWAT team poured out of the vehicles. Unbeknownst to you, these were a mobile task force sent in by the SCP Foundation, specifically MTF-Y99, also known as the Altar Boys, a specially trained group of Foundation agents used for anomalies of a religious nature. You, your aunt, and the rest of your family are rounded up to be debriefed and given amnestics. One of the last memories they took from you was the sight of Foundation agents dragging bloody bodies out of the church. As the doors opened, thousands of cicadas streamed out and disappeared into the skies. But these weren't like any kind of cicada you'd ever seen. They were beautiful. Their rainbow-colored wings reminded you of ornate stained glass. Who could have guessed that these pretty little bugs are tied to an entity very likely to bring about an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario someday in the future? The bugs, the bodies in the church, and even your aunt's incredibly strange behavior all fall underneath the umbrella of a Keter-class anomaly known as SCP-3004. But to truly understand this anomaly that was once thought to be destroyed, and the implications of it still living today, we need to go back 600 years to Ireland in the 15th century. This era was believed to be the origin of a Gaelic religious movement known as Caitlaji, or the Singers in English, a splinter sect of Druidism. But this was no fringe cult. The Singers were a mainstream religion in the British Isles for several hundred years. Its members included people of all social classes, from lowly peasants to powerful and respected figures. They mingled heavily with Christians, mostly Irish Catholics, and at some point in history came close to overtaking Christianity as the dominant religion in Ireland. So, who were these people, if they're supposedly such a large part of recent history in the area? Like most druids, their relationship with nature was a key part of their belief system. In particular, they prized an extinct species of cicada known as Cicadetta luculenta, or the stained glass cicada in English. The life cycle of birth and resurrection that the cicadas underwent fascinated the singers, and they performed a number of holy rituals around it. One recorded ritual was the celebration of children entering adulthood that was marked by them first losing their baby teeth. But the rituals of the singers accidentally opened some kind of door to a being from a different plane of reality, dubbed SCP-3004-1 by the Foundation. This being is an immensely powerful thought form that the Foundation believes to be a pittisphage, or faith eater. It appears to have been attracted to our universe by the rituals of the singers, and so took a form relevant to their beliefs, namely a huge cicada, in order to feed on their faith. If things had stopped there, then this would be an almost innocent symbiotic relationship, but the interactions between SCP-3004-1 and our world led to dangerous consequences due to its powerful reality warping abilities. For example, during some rituals, huge numbers of stained glass cicadas would burst from the mouths of those participating, often causing them to choke to death. Other times, 3004-1 would manifest physically in the sky above its new worshippers, causing painful boils on whoever witnessed it, and occasionally symptoms akin to radiation sickness. It appeared that 3004-1 was growing more powerful over time, and its rise to power was intrinsically linked to the rituals of the singers and the existence of the stained glass cicadas. Two groups that predated the Foundation, the Vatican's Congregation for Otherworldly Acts, and the English government's Royal Society for the Imprisonment of Abnormality, essentially performed an all-out religious genocide on the singers. No meaningful trace of the religion was left when they were done, aside from their own records. While they were at it, they also exterminated all the stained glass cicadas, leading to a complete stop of all SCP-3004 activity. It seemed like, despite the great human and ecological cost, the anomaly had been neutralized. A few centuries later, though, a series of strange cicada-related anomalous events started to occur across the United States. A strange man, seemingly made almost entirely from cicada chitin, would appear at christenings, weddings, and funerals. Each time his presence would cause the people in attendance to do and experience horrific things, and lead to legacies of hardship and death that would linger for decades. This became known as SCP-2852, or Cousin Johnny, and it should have been the first clue that the nightmare of SCP-3004 was resurfacing. But since 3004 was already archived as neutralized, nobody made the connection. Sometime later, SCP-2852 incidents ceased, and around that exact time, SCP-3004 instances started anew. It manifested in the form of strange, anomalous activities taking place at Christian church services, specifically those from Roman Catholic, Eastern Catholic, Anglican, and Episcopalian communities. The only clues to outsiders would be an increase in reported church attendance and an increase in deaths from natural causes within the community. These two stats were how the Foundation first noticed something was amiss. Just as it had done with the singers centuries before, SCP-3004-1 had latched onto the beliefs and rituals of Christians and was using this new connection to harvest more faith for sustenance. The results were twofold. First, religious fervor and excitement to attend church services saw a huge increase. Secondly, the actual content of these services took a hard turn for the horrific. Much like Cousin Johnny infiltrations, this really isn't for the faint of heart by any definition. For example, young people with Christ-like stigmata wounds being bitten to death by priests, children removing the teeth of priests before they all start vomiting huge numbers of stained glass cicadas. There were extremely unpleasant rituals involving castration, and even a pregnant woman giving birth to even more swarms of stained glass cicadas. We could go on, but you probably get the idea. Rituals inspired by SCP-3004-1 are horrific, and all seem to involve the same extinct breed of stained glass cicadas worshipped by the singers before their annihilation. But how can these insects, which have been dubbed SCP-3004-2, be here in the present if the Foundation Forerunners made them extinct so many centuries ago? The answer is simple, but strange. While they have all the hallmarks of being alive, the stained glass cicadas present during modern iterations of SCP-3004 events aren't actually real. Genetic tests have shown that they're actually made from a mix of wood and real stained glass. These insects fly away from the scene after the rituals are completed, traveling around 600 miles from the site before disappearing completely. The Foundation was growing concerned about the nature of SCP-3004, especially given that instances were becoming more frequent and harder to contain. Foundation scientists determined that the creature known as 3004-1 likely existed within a layer of reality just above our own, and if it ever managed to breach our reality, the world level of violence and chaos it could cause would likely lead to an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. Drastic actions would once again be needed to prevent this, so they devised an emergency containment procedure that would only be used as a last resort. The procedure, known as Protocol Damnatio ad Bestias, would use a mixture of mass amnestic treatment and thaumial objects to completely erase Christianity from not only the modern world, but all of history, in hopes of cutting off SCP-3004-1's food supply to kill the entity, or at least prevent it from entering our world. The plan would center on placing a powerful Roman Catholic reality warper, who volunteered for the job of course, into an anomalous group of machines known as the Lions. By submitting the reality warper to a lifetime of suffering and essentially erasing him from existence, so too will it erase the world's full knowledge of Christianity and hopefully save the world. This man will become the last martyr, dying for all of humanity. He will become the last saint, St. Jude the Damned, bulwark against darkness. You might ask, are you sure that's necessary? There's so much we don't know about 3004-1. Do we know for a fact that it's dangerous? Enter Agent Timothy Lutterman, a member of Mobile Task Force Sigma-25, also known as Ghostbusters. Lutterman was part of a Foundation project known as Site C Lux, using an astral projection technology that would free his consciousness from his body and allow it to travel freely between metaphysical planes. In plain English, they could use Lutterman's floating mind as a kind of spy and insert it into 3004-1's dimension. They achieved this by capturing one of 3004-1's false stained glass cicadas and releasing it again, allowing Lutterman's mind to follow it home to its master. However, what we thought would be a simple intel gathering mission turned into a complete nightmare. Lutterman found that 3004-1's dimension was entirely void, aside from the entity itself and the millions of buzzing stained glass cicadas. The entity was so huge and so complex that it physically hurt to look at. Lutterman observed that its form kept shifting, from a giant cicada to an old man to a cicada nailed to a wooden cross to an infinite mess of wood and stained glass. But even more terrifying than its physical appearance were the contents of its mind. 3004-1 forced itself into Agent Lutterman's brain, and in that moment, he finally understood it. The entity, which had no concept of metaphors, allegory, or the divide between fact and fiction, truly believed that it was the Abrahamic God depicted in the Bible, and that all Christians are lovingly worshipping it. In its rituals, it was imposing some of the bloodiest parts of the Bible onto its flock, believing that's what they wanted. All the while it fed on their faith, growing bigger and more powerful. Lutterman found that just being there with the creature was hurting his soul. If it wasn't a god yet, he believed it had the power to become one in time, and he advised the Foundation shouldn't send anyone else to its dimension. It was too great a risk to all life on Earth. Perhaps to prevent the horrible fate of all of us being destroyed by 3004-1, erasing Christianity would be a worthy sacrifice. That is, if it actually works. After all, they thought destroying the singers would neutralize 3004 once and for all. And yet, here it is again. For all we know, we may just be prolonging the inevitable.
History is often the greatest teacher. By looking at the past, we can learn from it with the benefit of hindsight. Such as in the early 20th century, when the entire planet was in the grip of a horrifying war. At the time, this conflict was often referred to as the Great War, although there was little great about it. Others knew it as the War to End All Wars, the largest armed engagement the world had known, although it would not be the last. Today, with that hindsight we just mentioned, we know it as World War I. In June 1914, an Archduke of Austria was shot dead by a Serbian assassin, and as a result of the complicated treaties forged between various nations, soon much of the world was involved in the war that started out as little more than a scuffle between neighbors. The horrors of trench warfare, the carnage caused by the earliest chemical weapons and armored tanks, left a permanent and lasting scar on the world's history, one still mourned and remembered to this day. The advances in chemical and mechanized warfare that took place during World War I range from the use of chemicals like tear gas used to disable targets, to more lethal compounds like mustard gas. And of course, this was the first war to introduce tanks to the battlefield. Although these were clumsy and cumbersome to begin with, it was arguably the advent of the First World War that forced many advancements in armored warfare. It was the belief of many individuals on all sides that if the Great War was made too gruesome and horrific to continue, it would come to its natural end. This, of course, did not happen, only encouraging each participant of World War I to continue advancing their weaponry. But what if there were weapons developed during World War I that were too dangerous to be deployed? With every side looking for advantage over their adversaries, what if some turned to the unethical, even the anomalous, to gain the upper hand in the war? Introducing SCP-196, otherwise known as To End All Wars. Try to imagine weaponry that was so incredibly advanced for the mid-1910s, yet so horribly and unjustifiably cruel. Worse than gas that can cause blisters to form not only on the skin but also inside the lungs. More advanced than armored vehicles with mounted machine guns crawling across no man's land. It's hard to picture something that could be more devastating than that, especially for the time period. But a good measure of a weapon's destructive power is usually found in the damage it leaves in its wake. In this case, SCP-186 is exactly that. Not the anomalous weapons themselves, but the site of a battle that took place between the 24th of July and the 13th of August in 1917. The event became known as the Battle of Husiatyn Woods, but you won't find any mention of it in the history books. Any and all records of the battle have been secretly expunged by the SCP Foundation, and their own archive is now the only place where someone can find the details of what happened over those few weeks. The engagement took place between the German Imperial Army and forces belonging to Russia's provisional government, a small skirmish in comparison to the enormity of many battles of the First World War. So what happened at the Battle of Husiatyn Woods to make it so horrible that it had to be stricken from the historical record? For that, we have to go back to Husiatyn, a small settlement in western Ukraine. In July of 1917, the surviving remnants of a Russian division had been scattered. The Germans' counterattack against the Kernensky offensive had driven the Russian troops to the dense forest that surrounded the town of Husiatyn. You might be forgiven for thinking that the outnumbered Russian force was decimated by almost 500 German soldiers pursuing them, but you would be very, very wrong. As the opposing forces met, they engaged each other in a fearsome battle. But this was unlike any encounter that had taken place over the course of World War I, or ever would again. Both sides were armed with anomalous weaponry, possessing technology beyond any that had ever been seen at the time. To this day, the SCP Foundation has been baffled by these weapons. Even with their unique understanding of the anomalous, Foundation researchers had been unable to replicate any of them, and instead keeps them secured in the munitions wing of Site-23, all under the designation of SCP-186-1. Among the recovered instances of SCP-186-1 is a highly modified Skoda M1909 machine gun. However, rather than behaving like a standard firearm, this gun would cause rapid-forming growths, not unlike tumors, to appear within the body of its targets. Another was concertina wire, a form of spiraled razor wire commonly used in trenches. Only this wire was coated in an unknown compound that caused permanent hallucination whenever the wire cut a person, and allowed the hallucinogen to enter their bloodstream. A number of rifle cartridges were also found littered around SCP-186. Sounds pretty normal for a First World War battlefield, right? Except these cartridges were not filled with gunpowder like you would expect them to be. Instead, they inexplicably contained human bone, ground into powder. The purpose of this ammunition or how it was manufactured is still unknown to the SCP Foundation. As if a gun that causes tumors and hallucination-triggering wire weren't bad enough, Foundation researchers also found a number of grenades used by the troops at the site of SCP-186. These were British Empire Standard Issue No. 27 grenades, but they contained a unique, anomalous gas that was capable of passing through any and all filters. Gas masks were developed during World War I to protect soldiers from mustard and tear gas on the battlefield, but these masks only offered basic filtration by today's standards. Even so, the gas contained in these grenades was strong enough to negate any and all filtration systems, but that was far from its worst quality. Did this unknown gas choke troops? Not quite. Did it disable them like tear gas? In a way, yes. But this gas did so by making any soldier exposed to it experience the sensation of having their bodies set on fire, constantly. Also recovered at SCP-186 were the remains of some form of explosive, and it is believed by the Foundation that it was detonated at the culmination of the Battle of Houston Woods, causing approximately a third of the battle's total casualties. Foundation researchers estimate that almost 300 civilians were either caught in the blast or died as a result of the crossfire between the German and Russian forces. The soldiers involved were also all permanently incapacitated or killed, or at least, almost all of them. So where did these anomalous weapons come from? And why were they used just in this battle, not throughout the First World War? According to records kept from the public by the SCP Foundation, the German troops in the Houston Woods were accompanied by a Hungarian advisor to their military named Matthias Nemes. Under his orders, they specifically targeted and tracked the Russian division that was retreating from them, who were similarly accompanying a French scientist, Dr. Jean Durand. It was these two men, Nemes and Durand, who were responsible for arming the Germans and Russians with their arsenals of anomalous weapons. They had ensured that their inventions of death had only received limited manufacturing, and had intentionally joined opposing sides of the war effort to test their creations in real combat. In other words, it appears that Durand and Nemes has been working together since the beginning of the war, and the troops they were with had been manipulated into taking part in a big test. These soldiers were just as unlucky as the civilians caught in the crossfire. Today, the SCP Foundation has established an automated security perimeter around the site of SCP-186, preventing access to anyone unless authorized. Everything within the perimeter is frequently patrolled and observed by security personnel. Why the need for so much security at an old battleground? Given the damage caused by the use of so many anomalous weapons, including those that the Foundation was unable to recover, the area of SCP-186 has become a hotspot for unusual happenings, even long after the Battle of Houston Woods ended. These anomalies include abnormal environmental or weather conditions. For example, all the trees in the southwestern portion of the former battlefield died and decomposed at an accelerated rate in 1923, while the temperature dropped to a permanent -15 degrees Celsius 4 years later. But yet there was never any snowfall. Then there were the sounds of gunfire in 1932, despite there being nobody inside the SCP-186 site. A number of years later, a pair of Foundation agents disappeared on a routine patrol of the area and were never seen again. Of course, 23 years after the end of the war to end all wars, the world was plunged into chaos and found itself at war once again. During this time, SCP Foundation personnel were instructed to evacuate the site of SCP-186, based on intelligence from their allied operatives who were working undercover inside the Third Reich. As the Foundation disembarked their observation posts, a faint glow was visible coming from SCP-186. 4 years passed, and the Second World War came to a close. The Foundation returned to re-establish their containment of SCP-186, and immediately discovered 13 corpses dressed in German army uniforms. bearing the insignia of the 4th Panzer Army. There were a further 27 bodies of soldiers wearing the garb of the Soviet 22nd Army. Both sets of bodies had already begun decaying, although someone had removed the dog tags and anything else that could identify these dead troops. It seems that history had, to some extent, repeated itself, as the Nazi and Soviet forces had clashed on the same battlefield where their German and Russian predecessors had fought during the Battle of Houston Woods. Years later, in 1959, a large sinkhole formed in the northeast portion of SCP-196. 4 men were found wandering nearby, all extremely disoriented, wearing decomposing military uniforms. Were they lost survivors of the Nazi-Soviet battle? No. These men were in World War I uniforms, German Empire and Russian Standard Issue. They had survived the Battle of Houston Woods and were somehow still standing, even though they should have died during the First World War. How did these troops manage this? Well, the final anomalous weapon recovered at the site of SCP-186 were mortar shells, but unsurprisingly, these weren't your standard high-explosive artillery. Much like those grenades mentioned earlier, these mortar shells contained a unique, previously unseen gas. But instead of causing the perpetual pain of being on fire, this gas altered the biology of animal cells that it came into contact with. Somehow, it triggered a change that prevented a body's cells from ceasing life function, keeping them continuously operational. In other words, it meant that any soldiers exposed to this gas simply could not die. That's right. Some of the troops involved in the Battle of Houston Woods are still alive to this day. The SCP Foundation immediately began excavating the sinkhole and discovered 23 bodies buried beneath in a mass grave. There were more of the surviving World War I soldiers, kept alive for decades by the mortar gas. Some of them still had infected wounds and battlefield injuries that should have killed them, yet their bodies refused to die. The soldiers were rounded up and hauled off to Site 23, where the Foundation researchers began assessing them. However, they were unable to glean any useful information from the German and Russian troops that had been unearthed. All of the soldiers exhibited symptoms of extensive psychological trauma and had developed various mental disorders while buried alive under the battlefield. They had all been driven to insanity, perhaps as a result of their unnaturally extended lifespans, maybe from being buried underground and unable to die for so long. Or perhaps it was the wartime atrocities they witnessed that drove the soldiers over the brink. History is a great teacher, but those willing to forget its mistakes are often doomed to repeat them. Matthias Nemes and Dr. Jean Durand created the anomalous weapons responsible for SCP-186, and similar minds would later go on to build the atomic bomb and countless weapons of mass destruction after. World wars, the suffering of countless troops and civilians. These parts of history mean nothing if we don't allow ourselves to learn from them. And maybe that's our curse as a species, that we are doomed to fight the war to end all wars again and again and again.
You hear their footsteps coming down the halls, or are those your own? Can you even tell the difference? You can tell they're getting closer and you can feel the hate, the rage. You turn, shaking, and finally see them standing right in front of you. But in that moment, you might as well be looking into a mirror. And who knows? Perhaps you are. You just don't seem to remember having so many reflections. Have you ever heard the saying, you are your own worst enemy? Of course, it isn't usually meant literally. But what if it was? What if you had to fight a monster that was you? All of your flaws are reflected back at you. Your strengths, your weaknesses, your deepest fears with no way to escape except a battle to the death. Either way, you're not making it out alive. It's just a matter of which version of you survives. But this isn't a thought experiment. No, according to the findings of the SCP Foundation, it's very much a reality. There is a place where this nightmare comes to life, and it's known as SCP-1919. SCP-1919 is a hotel and converted mansion built in the early 20th century. From the outside, it looks pretty much like it did when it was first built. and it almost looks like a comfortable place to stay, if you ignore the eastern side of the building that is sunk partially into the ground. The inside, however, is a different story, where it's clear the ravages of time have taken their toll. The floorboards and ceilings are rotting, collapsing in on themselves, and the rooms are filled with debris. It's deadly enough to explore the hotel for these reasons alone, but this is only the beginning of the danger for a person inside. In order to determine just how dangerous it is for either one person or group to enter the structure, the SCP Foundation planned a series of research expeditions into the abandoned building, led by Foundation scientist Dr. Lemkowitz. The first expedition seemed relatively normal, at least it did at the start. A 39-year-old Caucasian D-class male, known as D7, was sent into the structure with a camera and a communication system, guided remotely by Dr. Lemkowitz, or Dr. L, and another operative, a former head of the MTF Tau 11 Youth Hostiles, who is referred to in this file only as T11. When he arrived at the building, D7 was unable to get inside through the front door or windows. After several minutes of trial and error, he was finally able to get in through the western entrance. Dr. L picked up a strange, high-pitched whistling noise upon D7's entrance into the building, but it quickly faded away and was disregarded by T11. D7 discovered a torn painting, a portrait of a young woman with red hair. Next to the portrait, shallow scratches could be seen in the wall, the floor, and parts of the ceiling. Suddenly, D7 ducked into a hiding place alarmed. He and the other two operatives listening to his audio feed could hear heavy breathing, and it didn't belong to D7. Dr. L recommended that D7 evacuate the building at this sign of another entity inside, but T11 overruled, ordering him to disregard that instruction and continue his investigation. D7 was told to stay at a safe distance from whatever was inside with him and attempt to capture it on video. D7 turned off his flashlight in order to better hide, but T11 commanded that he turn it back on. Whatever was caught in the beam of light was difficult for the camera to see, but it threw D7 into a panic, and he began to run in the opposite direction. When prompted to explain what he saw, D7 simply said, "It was me." D7 ran through the dark, panting with fear and exertion. Unable to see where his feet were landing, he tripped over something and came crashing onto the ground, dropping the video camera. This allowed the observing officers to finally see what D7 was so frightened by, and it became clear just why D7 was so terrified. A man, identical looking to D7, approached from the end of the hallway, making its way towards the real D7. It was followed by another man who also resembled D7 and another, all running toward the original. They all looked exactly like him, with a few notable differences. They were dressed in the same uniform, with the same build and the same features, but each had something slightly off about him. One was missing eyelids, another had malformed hands, and the third had its lips fused together into a fleshy mass beneath its nose. Dr. L moved to cut the camera feed, but T11 demanded that it be kept running. D7 couldn't be seen by the camera, but the microphone picked up the sounds of flesh and cloth being torn, along with pained, panicked screams as the duplicates set upon him. After a moment, the screaming stopped. 2 hours later, the camera was broken, and the expedition brought to a troubling end. This was the Foundation's first glimpse at the creatures inside of SCP-1919, and it was not pretty. It did, however, allow them to begin understanding the nature of the building and what happens when a person goes inside. It appears that when a human enters the hotel, several humanoid creatures manifest throughout the building. These creatures look like the subject and are equipped with the same clothing or items that the subject brought inside with them. Though they are nearly mirror images of the subject, they are always slightly warped in a variety of ways. These have included changes to limb and digit length, joint mobility, sealed nostrils, lengthened jaws hanging loose and limp, missing eyelids, and lips that are fused together. These creatures are highly aggressive towards the structure of the building itself, as well as to the subject that they resemble. They do not, however, attack each other. They appear to operate with a hive mind, exhibiting swarm intelligence like that of an ant colony. Once they have been spawned by the entrance of a new person, they will not stop until said person either escapes the building or is killed. After the unfortunate end to the expedition, the Foundation prepped for a second trip inside. This time, 3 men were sent in with Dr. L's guidance, known as D3, D4, and D9. Video cameras were sewn into their clothes to leave their hands free and help avoid some of the issues that came up during the first expedition. This small team was sent in with the orders to terminate the remaining copies of D7 and further examine the hotel's interior. Upon opening the door to the building, they were immediately attacked by one of D7's copies, which D9 was able to quickly dispatch by firing his weapon at its head. Next, after a great deal of reluctance, the 3 men entered the building where they spotted something unusual inside. Dr. L was horrified when the camera feed revealed 17 discarded video cameras spread across the floor. They didn't have much time to react to this new discovery, however, because 2 doubles, one mirroring D7 and another mirroring D9, emerged from the wall and began to attack. Dr. L ordered the team to take shelter, then called the team of guards outside of the hotel's perimeter. They were ordered to begin an immediate full perimeter lockdown, preventing the doubles from leaving the hotel. D3, D4, and D9 attempted to make their way to a safe corner of the building, but found themselves met with a murderous double at every turn. At this point, Dr. L began to hear an unusual sound over the microphone feed, a high-pitched whine like that of a dentist drill. The operatives on the ground couldn't hear a thing, but on Dr. L's end, it was deafening. As the team proceeded deeper into the hotel, they became overcome with a strange feeling of foreboding. Dr. L ordered them to turn on their flashlights, but they refused and begged Dr. L to keep quiet. When prompted to explain, D9 said, "She can hear you." The operatives stopped responding, but their camera feeds caught a faint glowing white light coming from beneath the door. The door opened, and the light flooded the camera, making the images it captured hard to decipher. Just a few frames of a quick-moving female silhouette were captured before the cameras cut to static. The bodies of D3, D4, and D9 were never recovered, nor were their cameras. A third expedition was also sent into SCP-1919, but very little is known about what occurred during it. The video transcript is highly classified, and only those present for its events or approved to research SCP-1919 have access to it. An update to the SCP-1919 file following Expedition 3, though, indicates that new information was revealed about the hotel during the excursion. According to the file update, there is some kind of being at the center of the location, which is causing all of the other creatures, the doubles, to appear. The only information available about this being is the use of the word her in the official Foundation log about SCP-1919. This seems to match up with the last moments of the operatives in Expedition 2, when they told Dr. L that she can hear you, and the few frames of a female figure that were captured by their cameras. Nothing else is known that has been made available to anyone outside a very select few. Only the original report exists, and all other copies of it have been destroyed. The Foundation has undertaken special containment procedures to make sure that none of the entities from inside the hotel escape, whether they are the evil twins spawned by humans entering the building, or the mysterious female being at the center of the entire disturbing phenomenon. The Foundation has classified SCP-1919 as Euclid, and a 2-kilometer radius must be maintained around SCP-1919, with all roads leading to the building are blocked or diverted, so that no vehicles are able to reach it. This perimeter is guarded by a set of at least 40 armed and armored guards at any given time, as it has been determined that the doubles spawned by 1919 are equipped with whatever the human they are copying has. No one is allowed to enter the hotel with body armor or weapons of any kind. Anyone that approaches the perimeter that is not a part of an official expedition team will be immediately terminated. No new expedition teams are allowed to enter the building unless all doubles from the previous expedition have been exterminated. In the event that they cannot be exterminated, enough time must elapse between expeditions that the previous doubles have starved to death. Though they do not seem to feel hunger, the doubles do need to eat to survive, and will die when left alone for long enough. SCP-1919 has been sealed off from the rest of the world, so that no hapless civilians can wander inside and find themselves torn to pieces by warped images of themselves. But that comfort turns cold when you realize that the SCP Foundation still does not understand what causes these doubles to spawn. Is it scientific, supernatural, or something else? No one can be certain. Even more inexplicable is the entity at the center of all of this. An unknown female presence capable of wreaking frightening amounts of violence by turning victims' own images against them. What is the purpose of these funhouse mirror nightmares? Who is she? What is she? And what does she want? Currently, the doubles have shown no interest in leaving the hotel except to attack intruders. And thanks to that fact, as well as the reinforced perimeter outside, these copycats have not appeared outside of the building itself. But what happens if they do escape? Or if the entity that controls them decides to make her home elsewhere? There is no telling what could happen if this dark power is allowed to move beyond its current containment. Are you prepared to fight a vision of yourself, twisted almost beyond recognition, lunging after you with wide bulbous eyes, unnaturally long arms, and a distended jaw hanging down below its neck? Better hope you never have to find out. It was late October of 1993, and John Matthews of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina had just scored a date with Sarah, one of the most popular girls in school, and he had planned the perfect night out for the two of them. A haunted house had just been set up in town, and he, like many guys before him, figured he could use that as a chance to impress his date. He'd already been through the attraction, so he knew exactly when to put his arm around Sarah when one of the costume actors or animatronics tried to spook them. If any of them got too close for comfort, he might even punch them, just to show Sarah how brave he was. That would be a surefire way to impress any girl. However, John had no idea of the real horror that waited for him and his date through the doors of this seemingly normal funhouse. At first, the haunted house went as normal. John laughed at all the fake cobwebs and plastic skeletons, making sure Sarah knew how dumb he thought they looked. He shoved away actors dressed as axe murderers and told them to stay away from his date. It was dark, so they couldn't really see each other's faces, but John guessed that Sarah was probably really impressed. All in all, the date was going well, until they got to a room that John hadn't seen the first time he'd been through. It seemed like it had been added overnight, but at the same time it didn't mesh with the theme. The theme of the haunted house this year was Cannibal Hotel, but this room looked more like Dracula's castle, complete with actors dressed as Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and Dracula himself. One of them was even a dead ringer for the actor Vincent Price. John and Sarah watched, confused, as the actors performed their routines which, just like their surroundings, seemed out of place. It was total hackneyed, full of lame puns and very basic scares, though the special effects were undeniably impressive. When John and Sarah walked through the room, the actor dressed as Dracula stood in front of John and started pretending to hypnotize him. Up close, he did look a lot like Bela Lugosi, the actor who'd portrayed the Count during his first big screen appearance. This definitely threw John off a little, but unfortunately, this Dracula didn't have Lugosi's acting talents. "You are under my control," Dracula said, waving his fingers at John and staring at him. John, getting really sick of this, pushed the guy out of the way to move on to the next room. But when he did, he felt that something was really wrong here. He practically dragged Sarah away from watching the Wolfman transform and ran the rest of the way through the house, all of his bravado now gone. Sarah asked her date what was wrong, and he didn't tell her. How could he without sounding crazy? When he had touched that actor playing Dracula, something hadn't felt right. Even through his suit and cape, John had been able to tell that something was wrong. He was cold and rigid, not like a human being, but like a robot or a wax dummy. This is just one of multiple complaints from Halloween attractions around the United States that prompted the action of the SCP Foundation. Several witnesses described either seeing people that resembled classic movie monsters, or living wax models of those monsters appearing in various haunted houses, corn mazes, carnivals, and strip malls across the country. The Foundation has designated this troupe of hammy wax actors SCP-4153. During performances, SCP-4153 use wax to alter their appearance, produce props, including fake blood and gore, and even manipulate wax objects from afar. While this results in some uncanny special effects, the content of the performances tend to be pretty standard classic haunted house fare. They mostly do things like reenacting scenes from classic horror films and telling spooky jokes, with a little fake blood here and there. When the Foundation arrived at the Myrtle Beach attraction, they apprehended the various wax characters,
and determined that their eerie resemblance to the classic horror characters wasn't just makeup. After the horror some of these Foundation employees had seen on the job, living wax models of Frankenstein's monster and Dracula seemed almost cute in comparison, and the troupe of wax actors were taken to Site 9 for questioning and containment. The first member of the troupe to be interviewed on site was Dracula, dubbed SCP-4153-017 by the Foundation. He was interviewed by Agent Timothy West, who was totally unimpressed with Dracula's shtick. He tried to hypnotize Agent West, an act which he flatly refused to indulge in. Dracula provided the agent with seemingly no useful information, only responding to questions with cliches like, "We were all dead the whole time," and "The log was coming from inside the house." The next wax figure to be interrogated was Frankenstein's monster, aka SCP-4153-015, who was interviewed by Agent Samantha Henwick. Much like how SCP-4153-017 stayed fully in character as Dracula during his interview, SCP-4153-015 seemed to really believe that he was actor Boris Karloff, who played Frankenstein's monster in the 1930s. The SCP spoke in an exact imitation of Karloff's voice and speech patterns, and talked to Agent Henwick as if she was another actor on a movie set. He talked about how honored he was to be part of the project, and asked, "Are we rolling?" when he noticed the conversation was being recorded. Agent Henwick responded to the SCP's comments with confusion, a fact which he took to mean that she was staying in character. Like a true actor, he took a moment to prepare himself before pulling his own head off, much to the horror of Agent Henwick. The last and probably most interesting of the interviews conducted in 1993 was with the wax figure who resembled Vincent Price. More specifically, Vincent Price in his role as Henry Jared in 1953's House of Wax, a movie about a mad sculptor who made wax figures out of the corpses of his victims. This wax figure was designated SCP-4153-036 and was interviewed by Agent Gerald Penn. Penn started the interview with a simple question: "Why do you try to frighten people?" SCP-4153-036 had an equally simple answer: "Why does anyone try to frighten? It's fun to be frightened, almost as much fun as it is to do the frightening." Penn was skeptical, pointing out that the wax figure's act wasn't especially frightening. The SCP laughed dismissively, telling Penn to have some respect for the classics. Penn was still not having any of it. He had been with the SCP Foundation for 20 years at this point, and he'd seen enough real horror that the so-called classics had no effect on him whatsoever. He pressured Price for answers, but instead of responding with a straight answer, Price launched into a speech about his feelings on monsters. He said, "You'll call any oaf with a steak knife hunting gaggles of teens a monster these days. There's no wit, no humor, no charm. Where's the passion, the artisanship? Where's the sense of theater? Would you like to know something peculiar? I've almost never played a monster. Or I've played villains, most certainly, but not monsters. Only men besieged by fate, driven to revenge. Still, I've always had a fondness for them. Even as a child, I sympathized more with the monster than the hero." Agent Penn, who, at this point, was really getting tired of all the theatrics, started to interject. But when he opened his mouth to speak, he was only able to get a few words out before his tongue went numb and rigid in his mouth. He could no longer move it. Agent Penn tried to speak, but his tongue was too solid and heavy to do anything more than knock uselessly against his bottom teeth. He felt something dislodge inside his mouth, and he hoped maybe it was the feeling of his tongue being freed from whatever spell the SCP had put it under. But then he started to feel a tearing and a sticky heaviness in his bottom jaw. Agent Penn reached up and felt around inside his mouth. He started to scream indistinctly when he realized to his horror that his tongue had ripped off. He pulled it out of his mouth, and when he held it in his hand, his fears were confirmed. Somehow it had become nothing more than a lump of pink wax. Now completely tongueless, Agent Penn continued to babble frantically, no doubt trying to curse at the wax creature sitting in front of him. SCP-4153-036 finally paid attention to his interviewer's distress at this point. He turned to Agent Penn with a look of disapproval and disappointment and said, "Oh dear, your tongue seems to have gotten away from you there. Here, allow me." The SCP leaned towards Agent Penn, and though the agent wanted to resist, he found that he could no longer move his arms. In fact, his whole body had gone numb and rigid, just like the wax tongue. The only movement he was capable of was opening his mouth, and the wax facsimile of Vincent Price started molding his tongue back to the proper shape and reattached it inside Agent Penn's mouth. Agent Penn whimpered, unable to do anything while the SCP's hands were in his mouth. The creature said, "Hush now, I warned you about this. I told you that you mustn't disturb the wax before it hardens. That is a crucial part of the process. It needs to solidify. Otherwise, you risk disturbing the performance." By the time his tongue was reattached and resealed, Agent Penn was on the verge of tears. He gurgled, gasping for air, wiggling his tongue around in his mouth to make sure that it worked. The SCP returned to his seat, pleased with his own handiwork. "Splendid, splendid, good as new. Now, let's take it from the top, shall we?" Agent Penn took a deep breath, steadying himself as SCP-4153-036 whispered the word, "Action." Penn resumed the interview with the same simple question. Why do you try to frighten people? SCP-4153-036 gave the same simple answer. Why does anyone try to frighten? It's fun to be frightened. Almost as much fun as it is to do the frightening. The interview continued for only a few minutes longer, with both parties repeating only things they'd said earlier in the recording. The log ends with SCP-4153-036 once again saying, "Have some respect for the classics." Not long after the interview concluded, Foundation management completely lost contact with Site-9. A mobile task force was sent in to investigate the cause of this loss of contact, and on arrival, they found a catastrophic containment breach. Not a single member of on-site personnel was found alive, and strangely, all of their bodies seemed to be coated in wax. Further examination revealed that this initial observation wasn't the case at all. They weren't just coated in wax. No, every member of the Site-9 team had all of their major organs, including their skin, surgically extracted and replaced with sculpted wax. Of course, this was assumed to be the doing of SCP-4153, but oddly, all of the autopsies suggested that the removal of organs had happened weeks before the apprehension of SCP-4153, even though all of the on-site personnel had seemed alive and well right up until the containment breach. Outside of being replaced by wax, no damage was done to the bodies. It seemed that everyone had just dropped dead at the same time. There was one body that was different though, that of Agent Gerald Penn. Agent Penn's decapitated body was found in the same containment cell that had been used for SCP-4153-036. Next to the body was a photograph showing SCP-4153-036 holding up Agent Penn's screaming head, and on the back, a single sentence was written. "From one horror aficionado to another, always stay ahead." All of the SCP-4153 instances remain unaccounted for, and MTF Iota-10, also known as the Damn Feds, continue to monitor for new sightings and reports of activity that may be linked to the Wax Troop. Hopefully one day, they'll be taken into Foundation custody and contained, and maybe all it will take is for them to meet someone with a sufficient appreciation for the classics. The SCP Foundation is an organization that polices the abnormal in all its forms. Whether it's a multi-dimensional chaos god, a big scaly monster, or a very effective coffee machine, the Foundation takes a pointed interest in pretty much anything outside the norm. So you're probably wondering, what would they want with Mr. Smith, a man who was about as normal and average as could be? Mr. Smith was a 47-year-old African-American construction worker with a wife and daughter. He lived a modest but contented life. He had a close circle of friends, a happy family, and was well liked among his coworkers. But Mr. Smith had no idea about the anomalous nightmare barreling down the tracks towards him. Mr. Smith wasn't just about to have his life destroyed by an anomaly. He was about to become one. It seemed like a normal day at work on the construction site when he received a phone call. It was the police, informing him that his wife and young daughter had been involved in a terrible car accident. While this is anyone's worst nightmare, it was only the start of the horrifying things that were about to happen to poor Mr. Smith. That night, when Mr. Smith went to sleep, he fell victim to a strange phenomenon. He started to disappear. While it would be easy to write off as the result of mental illness, like a kind of stress-induced mental breakdown,
Mr. Smith wasn't the only one who noticed, or rather, didn't notice. His coworkers would slowly begin to forget details about him, even obvious things that you could glean from simply looking at a person, like clothes, height, or skin color. It seemed that little by little, ever since his family died, Mr. Smith was becoming an unperson. This led to increasing levels of fear, paranoia, and distress, as people whom he'd thought of as his closest friends could barely recognize him anymore. Thankfully, Mr. Smith wasn't just going to slip into non-existence without a fight. He realized early on that his new condition seemed to abide by certain rules. The effects got worse in the night when he was alone, but seemed to lessen somewhat during the day when he was interacting with people. It seemed that he disappeared just that little bit more whenever he wasn't being interacted with. And perhaps he hadn't developed this condition upon the death of his wife and child. Maybe he'd had it for a while, but it was the constant presence of his family that kept the effects from worsening. But now that he'd properly identified the problem, Mr. Smith could begin devising some solutions. If nobody else was there to interact with him at night, he'd keep his position in reality stable by interacting with himself. Mr. Smith would repeat his own name to himself regularly, reaffirming his existence to himself. He'd often check his own pulse to feel the rhythm of his heartbeat. He'd write detailed descriptions of himself, either on his own body or a surrounding surface. And in one particular stroke of genius, he devised a method of recording his own voice talking to himself, and playing it back while he was asleep to stave off reality decay. During the day, while at work or just existing socially in the world, he'd do everything he could to constantly interact with people. That way, they could keep reaffirming his presence, and therefore, continuing his existence. The symptoms of Mr. Smith's condition are somewhat similar to a rare mental illness known as the Cotard delusion, in which a patient believes they are dead, dying, or don't even exist. Except in Mr. Smith's unfortunate case, the delusion was becoming a reality. And this was a reality that Mr. Smith could only hold off for so long. Little by little, the coping mechanisms he'd built to manage his new life began to collapse. People in his inner circle truly began to forget him. His company no longer recognized him as an employee. To the people who barely knew him, he was little more than a ghost, a kind of palpable absence. This was the point when the SCP Foundation finally got involved. They swooped in and apprehended Mr. Smith, redesignating him as SCP-1467. It was one of the rare occasions that the Foundation didn't need to apply any amnestic treatment to bystanders, because, due to the nature of Mr. Smith's anomalous activity, almost everyone who knew him was already in the process of forgetting him. When the Foundation interviewed a man that Mr. Smith referred to as a close friend, he couldn't even recall Mr. Smith's basic physical traits with any reliability. Because of Mr. Smith's condition, the Foundation had real difficulty verifying elements of his backstory. Mr. Smith told the Foundation researchers everything about himself, about his family and his life before, but field agents were stumped whenever they tried to follow up on the information. First, there were issues with the existence and fate of his supposed wife and child. No records were ever found of either of these people existing, and there was no existing documentation to prove that Mr. Smith was ever married. The Foundation also looked into the deaths of Mrs. Smith and her child. There were no records of a car crash in the area that Mr. Smith directed them to. But that's not all. There were also no death records, nor any graves ever found. The construction company that Mr. Smith claimed to work for had no records of his employment. They couldn't find any of Mr. Smith's supposed extended family either. The only proof that he had ever existed was his physical body, locked in a Foundation humanoid containment cell, and Mr. Smith's own words. If you think this sounds like a living nightmare, then Mr. Smith would wholeheartedly agree with you. The effects of his anomalous nature traumatized Mr. Smith. He was diagnosed by Foundation therapists as suffering from bipolar depression, as well as chronic sleep deprivation. Though if you disappeared a little more every time you slept, you'd probably lose a lot of sleep too. The unpredictable nature of Mr. Smith's anomalous traits could have equally unpredictable effects on the nature of his containment, so he was classified as Euclid. Mr. Smith is one of the few anomalies that is referred to by his real name, at least to his face. When referred to as SCP-1467, Mr. Smith enters a state of rage and panic, and this mistake has caused several injuries for Foundation personnel during attempts to restrain him after using his SCP number around him. Mr. Smith is contained in a foam-padded cell to prevent self-destructive behavior, along with 3 audio recording devices, though these were installed at his own request, in order to continue his habit of recording his own voice to play back to himself while asleep. This served the dual purpose of not only mitigating his fading from reality, but also keeping him calm and docile during containment, and these devices are kept in good working order in order to avoid creating hostility between Mr. Smith and Foundation staff. While it may seem that the anomalous effects of Mr. Smith purely served to create a personal hell for him and him alone, the Foundation wasn't so sure. The fact no records could be found of his wife, daughter, or extended family was concerning. It raised one frightening question. Are the effects of Mr. Smith's condition contagious? If so, he could be putting a lot of people in grave danger. Foundation scientists, headed by senior researcher Dr. Thorne, devised a series of experiments to better understand Mr. Smith's mysterious condition. There were 22 experiments in total, but things began to get interesting at around experiment 16. For this experiment, Mr. Smith was forcibly restrained and brought into a research chamber with research assistants Rainier and Dieter. They were told to simply observe Mr. Smith without interacting with him, and record what happened in the process while Dr. Thorne supervised. At 10 minutes and 12 seconds, the researchers were unable to recognize the subject as Mr. Smith. At 14 minutes and 32 seconds, they were unable to recognize the clothes of Mr. Smith. Less than 10 minutes later, they were unable to identify his race. 5 minutes after that, they couldn't identify what Mr. Smith was currently doing. 10 minutes later, they couldn't even identify how Mr. Smith was sitting. At almost 40 minutes, the research assistants weren't able to identify anything of Mr. Smith, save for the fact that there was some kind of humanoid creature in the room. At this point, research assistant Dieter started a recording, instructing Mr. Smith to describe himself on record. As this happened, Smith returned to a describable state, curled up in a fetal position on the floor. There was no sign of the restraints or the chair in which Smith had been placed. Subsequent tests showed similar results, with minor variations in timing. Just by being in physical contact with Mr. Smith, the chair and the restraints had literally faded out of existence. Evidence was really pointing towards Mr. Smith's anomalous effects being potentially detrimental to the people and objects around him. But the experiments continued. They had to know more before there was nothing left to know. The next series of experiments were performed with D-classes and led Dr. Thorne and his team of researchers to a number of frightening conclusions. 2 D-classes locked in with Mr. Smith as he slipped out of existence began experiencing extreme states of terror and distress. Even when they could no longer see him, they could still feel the presence of an entity in the room. When the 2 D-classes tried to escape, one of them was almost mistaken for Mr. Smith himself. He too was now starting to slip out of existence. Both D-classes were summarily terminated, and Dr. Thorne began to wonder whether Mr. Smith's condition was contagious, or if he was instead somehow able to lash out at others in his vicinity in a more localized fashion. Only 2 other experiments were ever performed on Mr. Smith before further experimentation into his case was permanently suspended. In the first, a non-violent D-class was placed in Mr. Smith's cell and ordered to ignore him. Mr. Smith didn't take this well. He began attacking the D-class, who fought back, breaking Mr. Smith's nose. Ironically, this physical attack was actually beneficial to Mr. Smith, as the violence helped ground him in reality and secured his existence just that little bit more. In the final experiment, Mr. Smith was given a cellmate, a female D-class who was allowed to acknowledge him. The 2 appeared to become close, and their time helped stave off Mr. Smith's fading just a little bit longer. It's unknown if she contracted his fading condition or somehow was able to escape, but one day while Mr. Smith slept, she simply disappeared. Mr. Smith fell into a state of almost catatonic silence. Soon after, he began to speak again, only to repeat, "I don't want to go," again and again and again. Experiments concluded for good not long after. Because of his delicate mental state, Mr. Smith is allowed a visit from a therapist every week, and before any future experiments are performed on Mr. Smith, researchers are required to seek permission from his active therapist. Because of his effects on the minds of people aware of him, Foundation protocol is to terminate Mr. Smith immediately if he ever breaches containment. The site director has also appended a memo to Smith's file, instructing personnel to refer to Mr. Smith as SCP-1467 whenever he's out of earshot. Doing otherwise will incur severe punishments. Records on Mr. Smith are backed up in 6 separate copies and stored in different locations, in hopes that this will prevent the information from decaying, like Mr. Smith's existence. Mr. Smith's story is one of pain, tragedy, and existential horror. There's no shortage of SCPs that can cause XK-class end-of-the-world scenarios, but sometimes, the terror of these anomalies pales in comparison to SCPs that can bring one person's world crashing down around them. According to all the SCP Foundation's studies, it's likely that Mr. Smith will disappear sometime soon, regardless of their intervention.
Sometimes the SCP Foundation needs to get creative with how they go about securing, containing, and protecting. Sadly, not everything can be solved with a mobile task force or by locking it away securely in a concrete chamber. Which brings us to SCP-2480, otherwise known by the nickname, an unfinished ritual. When initially looking through the file on SCP-2480, the reader will immediately notice a number of discrepancies throughout. Parts of the entry have been crossed out. They've been struck through, so they are still readable, not redacted completely for the purposes of secrecy like many of the details in other SCP files. First and foremost, SCP-2480 has been reclassified multiple times, first as safe, then changed to the infamous Keter class, but now it is listed as far more ominous. Presumed neutralized. It's disconcerting, because presumed definitely leaves a lot of questions. So what exactly is SCP-2480? SCP-2480 is an area of dimensional abnormality, apparently created when an occult ritual was interrupted in November of 1952. Hence the nickname of an unfinished ritual. The source of this anomaly is located in a heavily forested town somewhere near the coast of Massachusetts. Of course, this state has long been synonymous with many occult happenings, Massachusetts famously being home to a number of supposedly haunted houses and sites of supernatural activity, and SCP-2480 is no exception, seeming to fit both of those criteria. In order to keep an eye on SCP-2480, the Foundation has dispatched Mobile Task Force Epsilon-6, also codenamed the Village Idiots. These operatives are working undercover in the surrounding area and nearby town, keeping watch for any sightings of anomalous activity. Meanwhile, another team, MTF Psi-9, the Abyss Gazers, are stationed nearby in case any incidents should arise. These operatives have been authorized by the SCP Foundation to employ the use of lethal force on any and all anomalous manifestations they should encounter. Their directive is to destroy without prejudice. That sure sounds like a lot of effort to secure something classed as presumed neutralized. The anomaly itself is centered around an old Massachusetts house known as Bodfell Manor. The manor was once the home of a millionaire industrialist by the name of Cornelius P. Bodfell III, who died in 1952 at the age of 86. And yes, he died in the same year that the ritual that created SCP-2480 took place. But we're sure that's probably just a coincidence, right? Interestingly, during his life, Cornelius Bodfell apparently had something of a fascination with the occult. It was likely this interest that drew him to creating a supernatural cult known as Adedium's Wake. Little is known about this organization, and Adedium's Wake are not part of the SCP Foundation's groups of interest, the list of other anomalous groups that often rival the Foundation. Much like the anomaly itself, they're presumed neutralized. The Foundation conducted a full-scale investigation into Bodfell Manor and were able to unearth more information about the aforementioned cult. Fortunately, Cornelius Bodfell kept a series of meticulous and detailed journals, as well as photographs that give plenty of insight into the activities of Adedium's Wake. Unfortunately, a lot of what they got up to wasn't all that pleasant. But what did you expect from a group of cultists? Adedium's Wake would engage in all kinds of depraved behavior, some that's better left to the imagination. What we can say is they'd often perform ritualistic human sacrifice and indulge in cannibalism, and these are some of their less unpleasant crimes. On-site personnel also uncovered sermon notes in Bodfel's journals, detailing the cult's services and occult practices. They also found lists of the Adedium's Wake members, including local wealthy families and respected politicians, other industrialists like Cornelius Bodfel, and even priests and other religious figures. The Foundation had previously been aware of Adedium's Wake, but initially dismissed the group as little more than a decadent upper-class social club not worthy of a full investigation. Let's review, shall we? We have a dimensional anomaly in a Massachusetts manor, a cult obsessed with the supernatural, and some sort of ritual that occurred in November 1952. But was interrupted before its completion. All parts of the same bizarre and twisted puzzle, but there's still a piece yet to be uncovered. That missing piece? The Global Occult Coalition. Who would have expected the GOC to rear their ugly heads around here? Though it's worth mentioning that many of the GOC's member groups are occult in nature, so it probably shouldn't come much as a surprise that they were somehow involved in this case too. It goes without saying that the SCP Foundation shares a complicated relationship with this particular group of interest, each often disagreeing with the other's methods. Occasionally, the GOC and the SCP Foundation will put aside their differences and act as allies against large-scale threats like the Scarlet King, but any alliance between them is often uneasy and short-lived. In the case of SCP-2480, the Foundation were first alerted to the anomaly's existence when they decoded a GOC distress signal, tracing its source to Bodfel Manor. When the investigative team arrived, they found deceased bodies littered throughout the estate, 36 corpses in total. Each of these were confirmed to be Coalition operatives, and the rest were theorized to be dead members of Adedium's Wake. Almost all of the corpses found at Bodfel Manor displayed signs of anomalous causes of death. Some had imploded, some disintegrated, and others had their bodies twisted into fatal new shapes. At first glance, and given the GOC's mission to destroy the supernatural, it looked as if they had stormed in and interrupted the Adedium's Wake cult while they were right in the middle of performing a ritual. Things went awry. SCP-2480 was created, and caused everyone nearby to die horrifically. Surely that's the whole story, right? Well, not quite, as it turns out. While there were no surviving GOC operatives for the Foundation to interrogate, the investigative team were unable to uncover documents related to the operation in a nearby safe house used by the GOC. Much of the official documentation was destroyed in an attempted cover-up, but a torn remainder of a mission report was recovered in the safe house's fireplace. It was actually the Global Occult Coalition who had initiated the ritual, though its true purpose was lost. The Foundation had learned that the SCP-2480 area had been inadvertently created by the GOC and their heavy-handed approach to their mission. But why would an anti-occult organization attempt a supernatural ritual? Theories as to their intention seem to point to the penultimate piece of the puzzle: Sarkicism, a widespread religious cult that worships flesh and disease. The very existence of this religion is viewed as a threat of apocalyptic proportions by the SCP Foundation. Sarkicism was initially founded by the Grand Karcist Ion, but it has since split into a number of smaller subgroups over the millennia, and among those groups, Adedium's Wake. The GOC mission report fragment gathered by the Foundation describes the operative's target to be Grand Karcist Ion himself. He apparently cannot be directly perceived, so few actual descriptions of his form exist. It has been noted by some to be humanoid in appearance at least, wearing what looks to be vestments similar to a priest's, and carrying a staff. Ion is able to disappear and reappear at will, and possesses a plethora of reality-altering capabilities. The Sarkic founder is able to shift and reshape any organic material, as well as having the ability to bend the very fabric of reality around him. While he may hold a humanoid shape, this entity is certainly not human, at least not any longer. Functionally immortal, Grand Karcist Ion is noted to frequently exhibit signs of malignant narcissism and megalomania. So now the story shifts. The GOC was attempting to use Adedium's Wake to summon Ion in order for them to eradicate the leader of the Sarkic religion. The plan backfired though. SCP-2480 was summoned, and both the cult and Coalition operatives were killed. End of story, right? Except there is one more twist in this tale of cults and secrets, and that twist came from the last place anyone would expect. It came from inside the SCP Foundation. After SCP-2480 was created by the ritual at Bodfell Manor, Site-13 was established in order to keep the anomalous area contained. You see, if the ritual was an atomic blast, then SCP-2480 was both the crater and the nuclear fallout from that blast. Except instead of causing radiation sickness, the entire area around Bodfell Manor became dimensionally unstable and prone to anomalous occurrences. Overseeing Site-13 was Director Simon Oswald, a Foundation bureaucrat. Simon had been selected for this duty thanks to his distinct lack of imagination, and because the anomalous area of SCP-2480 was thought to be inconsequential at the time. In 1988, Oswald failed to deliver his regular report on SCP-2480's activity. This was initially thought to be a simple error, except the Foundation couldn't get in contact with Site-13. Why? Because the unfinished ritual hadn't actually failed. It wasn't unfinished. The GOC had succeeded in summoning Grand Karcist Ion, and Simon Oswald had been the one to discover this. The founder of Sarcasm appeared to Oswald, who was converted and turned against his superiors at the SCP Foundation. Ion was able to exert his influence over the former bureaucrat, swaying him to change sides by showing Oswald a description in the Foundation's personnel dossier on him that referred to him as a mirthless dullard. Turning his back on the Foundation and pledging himself to Sarcasm, Simon Oswald was granted anomalous abilities by Grand Karcist Ion. Oswald was given the power to control an army of anomalous entities called Sarkites that he could summon through the area of SCP-2480. Grand Karcist Ion dubbed Simon with a new name, Karcist Karvas, and made him the leader of his new army. Their goal was to bring about the Sarkic religion's ideal, the dawn of a new age of flesh that would spell destruction for humanity. When the Foundation lost contact with Site-13, they dispatched 2 agents to investigate, Samuel Rowe and Sarah Valentine. Unaware of Oswald's conversion to Sarcasm and his new purpose as Karcist Karvas, both agents were captured by the Sarkite creatures within SCP-2480. The same monsters were also terrorizing the nearby town, replacing citizens and sometimes even kidnapping and devouring them. Another team was later sent in to survey the area, only to be killed or replaced as well, with only one survivor, Dr. Calixto Narvaez. Narvaez reported on the situation to the O5 Council, and in collaboration with the Global Occult Coalition, the Foundation launched an assault against Oswald. The joint task force of the 2 organizations were able to neutralize the Sarkites, reclaiming the area of SCP-2480 and capturing Simon Oswald. Without his control, the creatures became directionless, unable to so much as eat or defend themselves. Grand Karcist Ion's plan had been thwarted, and Oswald was taken back to an SCP Foundation site, though now under a new name, SCP-2480-1. However, during an operation at Containment Area 14, Oswald seemed to suffer no effects from anesthetic or surgical incision. Foundation researchers were horrified to learn that Oswald no longer possessed any internal organs, save for his brain, heart, and lungs. The rest of him was empty. Later, he was interrogated and began raving about Grand Karcist Ion so much that the doctor questioning Oswald attempted to attack him. Breaking free of his restraints, Simon Oswald amputated both of the doctor's arms before he was recontained by guards. Since then, the area of SCP-2480 has been mostly quiet, but it still remains under the Foundation's close watch, just in case any anomalous happenings start up again. But if you're planning a tour of the many haunted old houses of Massachusetts, we'd recommend maybe avoiding Bodfell Manor, just to be safe.
Robert Orlean and his partner in crime, John Streep, zipped through the murky waters of the Louisiana Bayou on a speedboat. These men were dealers in the illicit, but their specialty was not any kind of contraband you'd probably recognize. Orlean and Streep dealt in rare orchids, illegally poached from areas where they're considered endangered and sold to high-paying rare plant collectors. As any seller or collector knows, rarity is the hallmark of value, and what these 2 men would encounter in the swamp that day was truly one of a kind. The problem for this pair of greedy opportunists is that only one of them would live to tell the tale. And thanks to the SCP Foundation,
the other wouldn't remember it for long. That's what happens when you have a dangerous run-in with a certain mean green, swamp-dwelling creature that doesn't take kindly to unwanted visitors. And no, we're not talking about a crocodile. Orlean and Streep continued through the swamp, keeping their keen eyes out for the flash of light blue that'd give away the orchids they were seeking. Little did they know, from the murky darkness between the reeds, a pair of big yellow eyes were watching them back. They were intruders in a stranger's land, threats, just like the bad man. They would need to be dealt with accordingly, or a grim history would repeat itself. The boat came to a halt as the two poachers finally saw one of the rare flowers they were looking for arising out of the muck. Orlean leaped from the boat and began wading towards his prize. The flower would fetch him and his partner a pretty penny if they could get it back in good condition. The motions were so well practiced for Orlean, so automatic, that he didn't even notice something was moving through the waters towards him. Gators and snakes were an occupational hazard for people like Orlean. He kept a revolver holstered just below his shoulder as a precaution, but the thing about to kill him was unlike anything he'd ever faced before. Just as his careful fingers curled around the orchid's stem, Orlean heard Streep screaming from the boat. He was frantically pointing at something just beyond Orlean, emerging from the reeds. Orlean turned and felt his jaw falling open in horror at the sight of it. At first it seemed almost like a waterlogged corpse. Thick, matted black hair, heavy with grease and muddy bog water, teeming with parasitic swamp life. Her skin was green and bumpy like that of a toad, dripping with viscous green sweat that seemed like it could only be the byproduct of rot. But those eyes, those big yellow amphibian eyes, they were alive as they were inhuman. This creature wasn't a corpse, it was something else entirely. Her body cleared the water, standing at Orlean's height now and facing him eye to eye. She was naked, her dignity preserved by her long tangle of hair. Her body was human-shaped, except for her freakishly long, thin limbs. Her belly appeared visibly bloated or engorged, like a woman in the mid-stages of pregnancy. Orlean had never smelled something so foul in his entire life, which was mostly spent wading through swamps and bogs. She smelled like death itself. Streep was screaming for Orlean to climb back into the boat, but Orlean knew it was already too late. He reached for his holstered pistol, but before he could clear leather, the creature let out a horrific guttural hawking noise and spewed a stream of black goo onto Orlean's face. It was hot, sticky, and foul-tasting, like a kind of tar rendered from corpses. It plastered his open mouth and nose shut and began to suffocate him. He tried desperately to claw at his face and tear the offending substance away, but all that succeeded in doing was getting his fingers stuck. While Orlean suffocated and Streep screamed terrified obscenities from the boat, the creature just watched and smiled through rotten teeth. It was nice to see them panic, just like the bad man who'd come before. They were in the wrong. They deserved this. Orlean soon realized that nothing he could do would save himself. He'd spent his life in a dangerous profession and been lucky until now. But the Reaper catches up with everyone eventually. The last thing he saw as the world went black was this creature, this swamp woman, wading towards him through the water with a hungry look in her eye. She grabbed him on either side of his face and just held him there. What was that sound? Was it fizzling, like something was burning or even melting? She just kept staring and smiling with those awful rotten teeth. Robert Orlean went to sleep in her hands and never woke up. Back on the boat, a desperate John Streep was watching a scene that, if it wasn't for the later intervention of the SCP Foundation, would haunt him until his dying day. He watched his partner undergo a process that was somewhere between rotting and melting. He withered away in the swamp woman's hands, degrading into thick black sludge that she drank through her thirsty skin. As much as it pained him to leave his friend behind, Streep knew that there was no saving him now. All he could possibly do was escape with his own life. He pulled the ripcord on the boat's motor and tore his way back to the nearest township, the shape of the nightmarish swamp woman shrinking in the distance behind him. When he ran into the local police station, half mad with grief and fear, screaming about the monster that had killed his friend in the swamp, the police understandably detained him for further questioning. When his criminal history as a poacher was flagged up on the database, it became clear he probably wasn't leaving for a while. That's when a Foundation agent embedded in the department passed a memo about the case's strangeness up the chain of command, and a covert mobile task force was soon dispatched to the swamp in order to locate and capture the anomalous creature that Streep had claimed took his friend's life. After a few days of searching, the swamp woman was captured by the Foundation and redesignated as SCP-811 before being delivered back to a nearby containment site. Luckily for Foundation disinformation agents, the cover story was practically gift wrap for them on this one. It had been a dispute between two hardcore criminals, and as the saying goes, there's no honor among thieves. Streep had murdered Orlean over a pay cut dispute, and thrown him into the swamp where his body was eaten by gators. A few falsified records and implanted memories later, and the Foundation was free to do what it pleased with SCP-811. But the swamp woman would prove to be full of surprises and contradictions. While designated as Euclid, the containment procedures for the creature were rather extensive for its own benefit. Like a lot of creatures who'd never existed in captivity before, it had very specific needs in terms of its artificial habitat. The Foundation needed to be on top of everything from the pH levels of its soil acidity to the optimal temperatures and humidity levels of its containment chamber, built to resemble the creature's natural swamp habitat. The swamp woman is mostly non-aggressive to Foundation staff, but certain precautions need to be taken in order to ensure everyone's safety around her. While she's largely humanoid, her internal physiology vastly differs from that of humans. Her veins and digestive system are non-functional. She consumes her prey by melting it into black sludge with the highly caustic secretions of her skin, before absorbing it back through her pores. The waste material collects in her stomach, which she then expels voluntarily through an action similar to vomiting. This is often used defensively or in hunting prey, as the unfortunate Robert Orlean found out. As a result, people working in 811's containment chamber need to do so in pairs and wear heavily sealed hazmat suits for obvious safety reasons. The creature also proved to be surprisingly intelligent. While not a genius by any means, it was no mere mindless animal. The swamp woman had an intellect and communication skills on par with your average feral child, the one that had been brought up and socialized in a relatively normal home before being turned loose and experiencing a decline in its mental and social development. Her words have a childlike construction to them, as though English isn't her native language, and she's still in the very early stages of learning it. She gave herself a name, I, and began to cooperate well with Foundation staff in exchange for having her needs met. Since being brought into containment, she's made a number of requests. These include some requests that have been denied by the Foundation, such as the regular provision of bovine prey for its chamber and a variety of fish from its native environment to make it feel more at home. However, there are some requests that the Foundation has approved, like a wooden hairbrush and a D-class in a hazmat suit entering the room daily, in order to help wash her hair, often bogged down by the frequency at which her skin produces thick, caustic oils. In one particularly strange request, she asked for a turtle in a hazmat suit to act as a companion in her containment chamber, as she reacted negatively to the idea of having turtles as food. Sadly, this was one of the denied requests. SCP-811 was also involved in a few cross-tests with other anomalies, leading to curious results. After realizing just how dangerous SCP-811 secretions could be, Foundation researchers naturally floated the idea of using it on SCP-682 in its seemingly endless termination experiments. A sample of 682's flesh was successfully decayed by the dangerous mucus, so a larger quantity collected over a number of months was then sprayed all over the beast. It managed to reduce 682's body mass by 27%, melting its way through the covered flesh down to the bone. However, at that point, it was unable to decay further, and SCP-682 soon returned back to its normal state. Who could have possibly seen that coming? right? However, a much more interesting and enlightening cross-test occurred with SCP-978, the Desire Camera. If you haven't already seen our video on the Desire Camera, it's pretty much exactly what the name suggests. A Polaroid camera that reveals the deepest desire of its subject. And the Foundation decided to test it on a large number of staff and anomalies, one of those being SCP-811. When a photograph was taken of SCP-811 just staring at the camera, the resulting photo depicted a human woman with the same height, build, and facial features as SCP-811, braiding yellow ribbons into her hair and wearing a blue sundress. The attending researchers felt this raised an interesting question. Were they looking at an aspiration towards humanity from SCP-811? Or was this a yearning to return to what had been before? There was only one way to find out. Conduct an interview with the creature itself. When the interview began, the researchers pressed 811 on some of her earliest memories. One of the key details she shared was regarding a mysterious man whom she claimed came to her before she looked like she did now, back when her skin was soft and pink. The bad man. He injected something into her arm, and whatever it was, it changed her, mutated her, took away her precious humanity. The first thing she remembered feeling after that was an all-consuming hunger, and then melting and devouring the one who changed her, destroying any possible answers as to who he was or why he did it in the process. It was a story of victimization and dehumanization so cruel and upsetting that researcher Watchtel, an assistant researcher attending the interview, actually threw up. Later debriefing interviews revealed it was because he had a daughter of roughly the same age, with long dark hair. If SCP-811 has any parents herself, we may never know. Such is the strange tragedy of SCP-811. Whether you wish to call her by her number, a nickname like the Swamp Woman, or her self-given name of Ai, will likely never know who she was before, as not even she knows now. It is an unsettling reminder that all of our grasps on humanity are looser than you think. Sometimes all it takes is one chance encounter to change who you are completely. What is your favorite word? Think about it for a moment. Think real hard. Write it down in the comments, posted for everyone else to see. How many letters does it have? How many syllables? Say it aloud. How does it sound? How does it feel on your tongue? Really, really think about it. Now make sure you keep that word in mind. It's important, and we'll come back to it later. For now, it's time to talk about SCP-3449. Look, there's really nothing any special about this one. It wasn't even important enough to be mentioned with the other info hazards. It's not an evil talking toaster, that's for sure. SCP-3449 appears to just be a standard spiral notebook. Notebook? It's supposed to be notebook, right? Anyway, it's just a standard spiral notebook with a dark blue cover. It's safe class, and it's stored in the standard containment locker in Site-19. There aren't any other containment requires, but testing is currently underway to determine, I think it's meant to be determine, long-term containment requirements.
This is a mess.
Anyway, this item and its anomalous power is actually considered so inconsequential that researchers have explored the possibility of putting it on the anomalous items log, a place where items too useless to warrant a full file ends up. Geez, how do you misspell up that badly? It's 2 letters. Well, it's supposed to be 2 letters. How did you work Z into that? They aren't even close to each other on keyboard.
Man.
Anyway, the notebook contains mostly blank pages. Some are torn and only 6 contain actual writing. But due to the formatting of the writing, the text, consisting mainly of diary entries, is almost unreadable. This is due to syntactical errors, random capitalization, and rampant misspellings? Great, you misspelled misspellings. How cute. Apparently, all attempts to correct these misspellings fail, or even lead to additional misspellings. This anomalous effect extends to anyone attempting to write— Yep, that was spelled R-I-G-H-T. Anyone attempting to write about SCP-3449, including the script for this video, apparently. There are no further notable anomalous properties. Tests are ongoing, though those with any inquiries about testing SCP-3449 should contact lead researcher Nicolo Gurdnell. The notebook,
which was misspelled even worse this time, impressive, was first recovered by MTF-6, also known as the Village Idiots, after a series of info-hazardous and cognito-hazardous phenomenon were discovered in the Pittsburgh metro area. The source seemed to be a storage unit filled with anomalous items, and SCP-3449 was among-us. I think that's meant to be among them. The storage unit was registered to a man by the name of Edward Selsborough, currently designated as Porpoise of Interest 4335. Whew, that's the end of that. Thanks for watching the video, folks. Now go check out— oh, wait, there's more. Phenomenal. Let's keep going. Apparently, that version of the file was an older one. Let's check the next one and see if that's any more useful. Oh my. It appears that the updates here are actually quite extensive. Okay, let's give this another try. SCP-3449 is a Euclid-class SPC kept in the Humanid Containment cells of Site-19. Items affected by it are kept in standard storage lockers for safe-class anomalous objects at the same site. The primary reason for this shift is that SCP-3449 has changed its object of designation. It is no longer the Spiral Notebook. It is now a 34-year-old Caucasian man known as Edward Selsborough, formerly known as Person of Interest 4335. He is believed to be the creator of the Notebook, as well as other objects found in the storage looker in Pittsburgh. Foundation personnel are now trying to locate and contain any other objects created by Mr. Selsborough, though success has been limited on this front. That was cute. SCP-3449's analogous abilities manifest onto both Edward himself and all the objects created by him. Reading about him or any of these objects will result in syntactical errors, arbitrary capitalizations, and rampart spellings. Attempts to revise or correct the writing will either fail to remove the errors or create new errors. It appears that the anomalous effects of SCP-3449 proper are more severe than that of the ones caused by his anomalous objects. MTF-6, also known as the Village Idiots, apprehended SCP-3449 in his apartment just outside of Pittsburgh. He appeared to be in an advanced state of disorientation and dehydration. Records collected by the Mobile Task Force found that Mr. Selsborough had not left his apartment in over 10 days, which would account for his dire health conditions. Selsborough did not communicate with members of the Mobile Task Force, but did not reset arrest and subsequent containment either. Okay, these spellings are rough, but I'm going to try and power through. I am a professional, and we're almost there. The following is the full log of items obtained from SCP-3449's storage locker that also exhibit his anomalous effects. The notebook, as already discussed, the pages are either blank, torn, or illegible. Selsborough's computer. Files saved on this device include spreadsheets dealing personal finances, ideals for products, and an unfinished horror novel that is almost unreadable due to the poor quality of its writing. Grocery list had only 2 written items. Booter was spelled with only 1 T, and medication, which was spelled medication, a planner. Last entry was dated 2 weeks before containment and believed to contain reminders to perform various chores. However, a mixture of poor handwriting and word choice allows for other interpretations. And finally, Mr. Selsborough's cell phone. Foundation researchers were also able to collect the call logs in hopes of further tracking Selsborough's pre-containment activities. The last 3 calls, which were all made on the same day 2 weeks before containment, dialed different numbers, only one of which was in use. The Foundation made contact with the receiver of said call, who had no knowledge of SCP-3449, and claimed that they did not answer the call. Lead researcher Nicolo Gurdinel conducted the first interview with SCP-3449 shortly after his capture. When he entered the interview chamber, he found that SCP-3449 was just sitting in the corner, with his head in his hands, rocking back and forth in what appeared to be apparent distress. He then began looking down into his lap and twiddling his thumbs like a child. Nicolo engaged him in a calm and polite tone. addressing him as SCP-3449. The anomaly made eye contact with Dr. Gurdnell, but he didn't respond, and instead continues staring at him. As Gurdnell asked further questions, Salzberg simply didn't answer, or would, at the very most, acknowledge the questions with simple gestures. Gurdnell asked whether Salzberg was making products for his business, to which he smiled and shook his head. Gurdnell then asked Salzberg whether he could speak or not, or if it was merely a choose on his part. Unsurprisingly, Salzberg offered no explanation, and the interview came to a close shortly afterwards. Tests are still ongoing to find out if Salzberg's inability to SPAC or communicate come as a result of his anomalous traits, or if this is simply a result of apophonia, a uncommon but non-anomalous condition that renders its victims unable to spike. Tests have confirmed that Salzberg does have all the organs required for vocalization, but appears to not use them. Further tests are required. Alright, there we have it. That was a complete nightmare to read thanks to SCP-3449's anomalous effects, but at least it's over now. Now, go check out… wait, there's more. Another update to the file. Good, okay. Alright, let's go take a look. Oh, I see. This is a lot more dangerous than I thought. I suppose I better read on. SCP-3449 has been upgraded to Keter Class Anomal. SCP-3449-A, the new designation for Edward Salzberger, is to be kept in a high-security hazmat containment in Site-19. The inanimate anomalous possessions of Edward Salzberg are to be kept in standard object containment. Any reports written on SCP-3449 must be rotten by people who have been exposed to it for less than 7 days in order to keep the files rateable. To prevent this infectious info-hazmat from spread further, the number of people allowed to interact with this anomaly is kept relatively small and consists of those that have already been exposed at some point or another. This includes O5-8, MTF-6, Dr. Teller's research team, some additional personnel selected for XPC-3449 research, and personnel chosen to update SCP-3449 documentation. Some additional personnel selected for XPC-3449 research and personnel chosen to update SCP-3449 documentation. While Edward Salzberg and his personal effects are chronically locked up, SCP-3449 is not currently considered contained. Research into the spread of SCP-3449's effects, the vectors for transmission, and any potential remedies for its degenerative effects are now top priority for all involved before this whole thing gets out of hand. Further research has taught the Foundation that not only are Salzberg and his items powerful info hazards, their anomalous effects appear to be able to infect these who experience them permanently. Initially, it will appear that writing quality only degrades when the subject is actually writing about SCP-3449 itself, but over time they'll come to the frightening realization that it actually affects their writing as a whole. The effect also progresses in its severity over time, eventually rendering the victim's ability to write legible sentences completely destroyed. The initial anomalous effects of SCP-3449 were discovered when MTF-6 writes their field reports on the matter and found it littered with syntactical error, random capitalization, and rampant impellings. Similar errors appearing in the initial fail about SCP-3449 only serve to reaffirm this observation. However, researchers only began to notice true extent of SCP-3449's effects when the Village Idiot's field reports concerning other Solomines came in with equally atrocious writing. Attempts to correct this writing simply led to more mistakes and frustration on part of team. Soon after, a researcher named Dr. Teller, who'd since taken over the SCP-3449 case, and his team found that they were experiencing similar issues. They couldn't just make the blurs happen, no matter how hard they concentrated. They forgot spellings. They couldn't make hand move in the manner they waited to in order to form the wards. Even the most intelligent and articulate members of the team came across as extremely young children on page, but didn't stop there. Wasn't long before researchers who'd never worked on the SCP-3449 case started to exhibit these same suspicious errors in own writing. The Foundation didn't know how, but this slickness was starting to spread, with people's abilities to write degrading across the entire Foundation. That's when a Foundation web trawler picked up something even more disturbing. Global literacy seemed to be taking a dive. The telltale syntaxical error, random to capitalization, and rampant ling misspellings ticking up everywhere and for everyone. And the end of writing would be one thing, but SCP-3449 doesn't stop there. No, that's just the beginning. Morse code go next, then pictograms. Not long for sign language become hopeless scrambled. Communication breaks down little by little. People can't draw anymore, can't move right hands. Call goes, calls, codes, last go, his voice. Talking gets hard. Remember favorite word? Think about it, say it loud. When SCP-3449 done, when everyone infected, you'll never say again. Nobody will ever say again. Now go check out Minecraft World Destroyer, SCP-4335, A Welt in the Crucible, and SCP-055 Anti-Meme Unknown for more mind-bending anomalies from the SCP Foundation.